Chapter 16. The Alcoran, or the Sword. The 6th of August, 1838, was Election Day in Missouri, and the Mormons, for the first time in 5 years, were choosing to vote. John D. Lee lay sprawled upon the grass in the public square at Gallatin, the county seat of Daviess County, where the vote between the Mormons and the Old Settlers was expected to be. He listened in silence while one of the candidates, William Penniston, harangued against the Saints. They are a set of horse thieves, liars, and counterfeiters. They'll swear a false oath on any occasion to save another Mormon. They are thieves and knaves and dupes in the bargain, and no property is safe in Daviess County if they continue to pour into the. If you suffer the Mormons to vote in this election, it will mean the end of your suffrage. When the first Mormon stepped out of the group and walked silently over to the polls, a grinning settler barred his path. Daviess County don't allow Mormons to vote no more, he said. When the man began to argue, the Missourian knocked him down. Immediately a fight broke out. The Mormons, about 30 in number, against over 200, were standing conveniently near a pile of oak hearts, each one 4 feet long and weighing about 7 pounds. They made, said Lee, a very dangerous yet handy weapon. Lee jumped into the melee when he saw John L. Butler give the Danite signal for assistance. I was an entire stranger to all who were engaged in the affray, he wrote, but I had seen the sign, and, like Samson, when leaning against the pillar, I felt the power of God nerve my arm for the fray. Butler was signaled out for a special attack, but he knocked a man down with every blow of his club. When I called out for the Danites, he wrote later, there was a power rested upon me such as one I never felt before. I never struck a man the second time, and while knocking them down, I really felt that they would soon embrace the gospel. The riot was short, for the Missourians fled before the billets, but not before 9 men were stretched on the ground, and a score of others were crawling away fearfully bruised. Butler then climbed to the top of the pile of lumber, and said quietly, my ancestors served in the War of the Revolution to establish a free and independent government. A government where all men have equal rights. I aim to have my rights as a free-born citizen, even if I have to fight for them. As for my religion, that's a matter between my God and me, and no man's business but my own. This day I am going to have my vote, and I'll die fighting before I am driven from these polls without it. The little knot of Mormons, still gripping their oak hearts, proceeded to the polls unmolested, and every man voted. Butler's own account of this fight was copied into the unpublished journal history in the church library in Salt Lake City, under the date the 6th of August, 1838. See also John D. Lee. Mormonism Unveiled, pages 58 to 60. This incident smashed the fragile peace that had prevailed in Upper Missouri. Actually, no one was killed in the fray, but the runner who brought news of it to Far West said that 2 Mormons had been slain, and that Adam Black, who was justice of the peace in Gallatin, was uniting the Gentiles in an army to expel the whole colony of Adamonte-Ammon from Daviess County. Avard at once called out the Mormon troops in Far West, and Rigdon spurred them to deeds of valor. Now we as the people of God do declare and decree, he shouted, brandishing his sword, by the great Jehovah, the eternal and omnipotent God that sits upon his vast and everlasting throne, beyond that ethereal blue, we will bathe our swords in the vital blood of the Missourians or die in the attempt. As reported by William Swartzel, Mormonism Exposed, page 29, Joseph accompanied the little army to Adamonte-Ammon, where he learned that the election riot had been much exaggerated. Instead of returning to Far West, however, he made the mistake of marching his men to visit the Justice of the Peace, Adam Black. He entered Black's cabin with Avard and several others and demanded that he sign an agreement of peace. Compare Joseph's account of this interview in his History of the Church, Volume 3, page 59, with the sworn statement of Adam Black, published in Correspondence, Orders, etc., pages 55-7. After some argument, Black wrote out a statement promising to support the Constitution, and the Mormons retired. As soon as the rabid Mormon baiter Penniston learned of this visit, he magnified it into a story of intimidation and threatened murder, advertising the incident clear to Jefferson City. The judge of the Circuit Court, Austin A., King, who had hated the Mormons ever since his brother-in-law had been killed in a Mormon Gentile riot in Jackson County, immediately issued a warrant for Joseph's arrest. Knowing that a trial in Gallatin was an invitation to a lynching, Joseph refused to give himself up unless he could be tried in his own county. When Lilburn Boggs, now governor, heard of this, he ordered out 6 companies of militia to enforce King's warrant. Joseph capitulated, but through the intervention of his lawyers and old friends Donovan and Atchison, he won the concession that he be tried, not at Gallatin, but half a mile inside the Davis County border. The prophet then stationed his own army along the county line and went to trial, secure from the threat of an impromptu hanging. He was bound over on a $500 bond to keep the peace. The trial did nothing to mitigate the hatred intensifying against the saints. Millers refused to grind Mormon grain at any price, and flour in Far West soon disappeared altogether. The women tried to boil the unmilled wheat and grated their corn on crudely perforated tin pails. The corn proved edible when baked with pumpkin, but the wheat was sodden and indigestible. Hundreds of newly arrived immigrants living in covered wagons or bark tents looked at the fast approaching winter with panic. Armed bands of Missourians prowled about, firing haystacks and granaries, stealing horses and cattle, and whipping Mormon farmers. Daily it became clear that in every county save Caldwell, the Gentiles were hell-bent to drive the Mormons out. Soon the 2 big Mormon settlements of DeWitt and Adamandi-Ammon were in a state of siege, the women and children herded behind hastily improvised stockades, living off cornmeal and freshly killed cattle. When these provisions were gone, and the Mormon men were worn out with watching, the land agents who had originally sold them their property sent word that they were willing to buy back the preemption rights whenever the sect agreed to leave. This extortion turned the Mormons sick. By this time, the prophet had expanded the Danite band into the armies of Israel, which included nearly every ape. One convert, after describing in a letter the duties of the various companies, guarding, spying, foraging, arms manufacturing, and so on, wrote frankly, "Those companies are called Israel's army because the prophet Daniel has said, 'They shall take the kingdom and possess it forever.'" Brother Winchester letter, copied into the journal history under the date the 19th of November, 1838. Despite the extensive organization and drilling of this army, it was still purely defensive. Joseph forbade any retaliation for the depredations of the old settlers and worked desperately with his lawyers to effect a peace. For a time, it seemed as if his prudence would bear fruit. Donovan came very near wiping out the Davis County trouble by persuading the old settlers to sell out to them. But before this plan could be worked out, the old settlers in Carroll County formally demanded that the Mormons leave DeWitt, the Mormon river port. They set the deadline at the 1st of October. Joseph replied coldly to this ultimatum by reinforcing the town with 200 newly arrived Canadian converts, whereupon the Missourians laid siege to DeWitt in earnest, firing on every. When General Lucas, who commanded the militia in this area, heard of the skirmishes, he wrote to Governor Boggs, "If a fight has actually taken place, of which I have no doubt, it will create excitement in the whole of Upper Missouri, and those base and degraded beings will be exterminated from the face of the earth. Correspondence, orders, etc." Pages 34 to 5. Under cover of darkness, Joseph made his way to the beleaguered town. He found his people desperate for food and fuel and pathetically eager for miracles. The Missourians had caught some of the men out foraging and had beaten them into unconsciousness with hickory switches. The prophet looked at their backs ribboned with welts, and the rage that was so slow to mount in him surged into his throat. But he could not call down thunderbolts, and that is what it would have taken to aid these saints, outnumbered as they were by 10 to 1. "Come back to Far West," he told them dully, and sent out a flag of truce. When the wagons filed into Far West, a sullen, hopeless anger swept over the people. One woman, weak from childbirth, had died on the way, and when they learned of it, the oldest converts began to count again the toll of martyrs to the gospel. But the younger men were cold to memories and eager for revenge. Nothing was gained by surrender, they said, nothing but death. And when Donovan brought word that negotiations with the settlers in Davis County had broken down, and a mob of 800 men was threatening to devastate Adamandi-Ammon, it seemed a confirmation of their worst fears. If Carroll County can root the Mormons out, why not Davis? The old settlers were arguing. To hell with compromise. To hell with Donovan's peace settlement. The land sales are coming on, and if we drive the Mormons out, we can get all the lands open to preemption. We can get all our land back again, as well as all the pay we've got so far. Joseph called every able-bodied Mormon in Caldwell County to the far west public square. There on the 14th of October, he broke his long public silence. Except where noted, all the details of this chapter are taken from the history of the church. This speech, however, was not recorded there, and the report given here is based upon the accounts of 7 men. See the affidavits of T.B. Marsh, Orson Hyde, George M. Hinkle, John Correll, W.W. Phelps, Samson Avard, and Reed Peck in Correspondence, Orders, etc., pages 57-9, 97-129. The Marsh and Hyde account, which was made on the 24th of October, is particularly important. Part of it was reproduced in History of the Church, Volume 3, page 167. See also the Peck manuscript, page 80. Joseph himself barely mentioned the speech in his history. See Volume 3, page 162. "We are an injured people," he began. "From county to county we have been driven by unscrupulous mobs eager to seize the land we have cleared and improved with such love and toil. We have appealed to magistrates, judges, the governor, and even to the President of the United States, but there has been no redress for us. The latest reply of Boggs to our petitions is to tell us to fight our own battles, and that, brethren, is exactly what we intend to do." The crowd cheered his sober words as they had never cheered Rigdon's most truculent outbursts. "I have a great reverence for the Constitution," he went on, "but for the laws of this state I have no regard whatsoever, for they were made by a parcel of blood. General Donovan has authorized this body to act as a regiment of the state militia under the command of Colonel Hinkle. We are therefore acting within the law. All who are with me will meet tomorrow to march to the defense of Adamandiaman with the words of the Savior ringing in our ears. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his brethren." He looked over the crowd as if searching for a familiar face. "Some of the brethren aren't here today," he said. "Some of those that Brother Sidney likes to call, 'Oh, don't men.' In time of war we have no need for such. A man must declare himself friend or enemy. I move a resolution that the property of all oh don't men be taken over to maintain the war." As the crowd laughed and applauded, Rigdon started up, his eyes blazing. "And I move," he shouted, "that the blood of the backward be spilled in the streets of Far West." But Joseph silenced him. "No, I move a better resolution. We'll take them along with us to Daviess County, and if it comes to a battle, we'll sit them on their horses with bayonets and pitchforks and make them ride in front." The men cheered, and the tension relaxed a little. Joseph went on to tell an anecdote. An army captain was stationed in a village with his regiment, which badly needed food. The captain found a Dutchman with a rich harvest of potatoes, but the man refused to sell. Explaining the matter to his men, the captain thrice warned them not to let him catch them touching the potatoes. But the next morning, he paused. There was not a potato in the whole patch. The men grinned. Their families were hungry and wretched. They had lost horses, cattle, blankets, and wheat to their neighbors, and needed no bolder hint. As Joseph neared the end of his speech, all the pent-up hatred that he had so long suppressed broke forth with unexpected violence. "If the people will let us alone," he cried, "we will preach the gospel in peace. But if they come on us to molest us, we will establish our religion by the sword. We will trample down our enemies and make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. I will be to this generation a second Mohammed, whose motto in treating for peace was the Alcoran or the sword. So shall it eventually be with us, Joseph Smith or the sword." 100 Mormons marched into Adamandiaman the next day to reinforce the 250 men assembled under Lyman White. After a conference with the prophet, White addressed his men. He stood by a fine brown horse with his famous bear skin flung over the saddle. A red handkerchief was bound about his head Indian fashion, with the knot in front, and his collar stood open, showing his naked, hairy breast. "The sword has now been drawn," he shouted. flourishing an enormous cutlass, and shall not be sheathed until we have won back everything the mobs have wrenched from us. Our cause is just. The Lord is on our side, and it makes no difference if our enemies number 50 or 50,000. As related by George Hinkle and James B. Turner in Correspondence and Orders, etc., pages 525 to 139-40, and by John D. Lee. Mormonism Unveiled, pages 73 to 4. White's fierce aspect and bravado caught the men up in the wildest enthusiasm. John D. Lee said that he felt himself bulletproof. I thought that one Danite would chase 1,000 Gentiles and 2 could put 10,000 to flight. The Gentile spies who heard the speech rushed away to spread the news that the wild ram of the mountains had 15,000 men under arms, ready to descend upon mob and militia alike. News that the Mormons were on the offensive was a terrific shock to the Gentiles in Daviess County. They scattered into the wind. When David Patton charged into Gallatin with a mounted company, he found it almost deserted. The men promptly looted Jacob Stollings's store and then set fire to it, along with several cabins. Young Oliver Huntington, who had already joined the Danites but had been forbidden to go on the expedition to Gallatin because of his tender years, climbed Tower Hill and stood on Adam's altar to see what he could of the expected fight. I saw the smoke rising toward heaven, which filled me with ambition, he related. In tears I looked far over the trees and wished and sighed and wished again that I was there. The next day I went to Bishop Knight's and saw the plunder, and heard them tell in what order they took the place. Unpublished Diary of Oliver Boardman Huntington. See typewritten transcript in the Utah State Historical Society Library, Volume 1, pages 31 to 4. In his history, Joseph Smith denied all stories of burning and pillaging, insisting that the mobs had fired their own cabins to cast blame upon the Mormons. But in a correspondence with Jacob Stollings, who was trying to discover if his account books had been burned along with his store, Joseph virtually admitted that the Mormons had been responsible. See History of the Church, Volume 3, pages 316-378. John Whitmer, in the last chapter of his manuscript, History of the Church, wrote that the saints began to rob and burn houses, took honey which they called sweet oil, and hogs which they called bear, and cattle which they called buffalo. See also The Return, Volume 1, December 1889, page 189, and the testimonies of the eyewitnesses to the Mormon depredations, John Raglan, George W. Worthington, Porter Yates, Patrick Lynch, and William Morgan, in Correspondence, Orders, etc. Adam Black and William Peniston swore that their own houses had been destroyed. Thomas B. Marsh and Orson Hyde confirmed these stories ibidem, pages 57 to 9. While Patton was raiding Gallatin, White, with another company, attacked Millport, and Seymour Brunson attacked Grindstone Fork. They rounded up all the horses, cattle, and hogs they could find and drove them back to Adamondiaman, but did not burn the cabin. Back in far west Rigdon, spread news of victories and applauded when the first wagons piled high with consecrated property pulled into the square, but he was quick to see that the plunder was a horror to many saints. One by one, the disapproving and the faint of heart stole away with their families in the night. News of every fresh defection made Rigdon wild with anxiety. When Thomas B. Marsh, president of the Apostles, and Orson Hyde, also an apostle, joined this exodus, he mounted his stand in the schoolhouse and blistered them with his hate. The last man has run away from far west that is going to. The next man who starts shall be pursued and brought back, dead or alive. I move a resolution that if any man attempts to move out of this county, or even packs his things for that purpose, then any man in this house who sees it shall, without saying anything to any other person, kill him and haul him aside into the brush. All the burial he shall have will be in a turkey buzzard's guts, and nothing will be left of him but his bones. Yesterday, he finished significantly, one man in far west slipped his wind and was dragged into a hazel bush for the buzzards to pick at. But the man who lisps it shall die. This speech was reported in detail by W. Phelps and confirmed by Burr Riggs and Benjamin Slade. See Correspondence, Orders, etc., pages 520 to 534 to 6, 143. Hyde returned to the church in 1839, Phelps in 1841, and Marsh in 1857. By this time, the Gentiles had learned of the Mormon depredations. Within a week, every isolated Mormon cabin was a pile of ashes. The old settlers blandly sent their intentions to the press. "We believe in less than 6 days Far West will be burnt, and her fugitives driven from the borders of the state." Letter signed Accidentalist, dated the 22nd of October, 1838, and published in the Missouri Argus, St. Louis, the 1st of November, 1838. When Joseph ordered everyone into either Far West or Atamondiaman for protection, Gentile spies spread the report that an immense Mormon army was gathering which would lay waste the whole upper portion of the state. 2 of the worst Gentile incendiarists sent an express to Governor Boggs on the 24th of October, reporting that the Mormons had massacred a whole militia company of 50 men. Richmond, they said, was to be attacked at any moment. "We know not the hour and minute we will be laid in ashes. Our country ruined, for God's sake give us assistance as quick as possible." Letter from Sachiel Woods and Joseph Dixon, Correspondence, Orders, etc., page 60. The letter was a fantastic fabrication. The militia company in question, led by a Methodist minister, Captain Bogart, had been ordered to patrol the border of Caldwell County, and on the day of the supposed massacre it had done nothing more exciting than to enter the county illegally and capture 3 Mormons. This capture, however, had tragic repercussions, for the Mormon scout who brought news of it to the prophet was certain that the 3 men were to be shot at sunrise. Joseph at once dispatched 60 men under Captain David Patton to effect a rescue. Bogart's men were strategically entrenched behind a slough bank in a scattering of oak timber on Crooked River. A thick grove of hickories on the nearest ridge made it impossible for anyone approaching from the east to discover the militiamen until practically upon them. The 60 Mormons came up over the ridge at dawn, their bodies silhouetted against the brightening sky. The guards took careful aim and fired, killing 1 Mormon outright, and then fled to give the alarm. Patton at once ordered a charge down the hill, and the men rushed down in a fast trot, shouting, "God and liberty!" Patton led the charge, his white coat gleaming in the early light. The Mormons made perfect targets, and 3 or 4 fell at the first volley, but the men rushed on into the oak grove with drawn swords and charged over the slough bank. All of Bogart's men fled but 1, who hid behind a tree long enough to take careful aim at Patton's white coat. Struck in the abdomen, Captain Fernot dropped to the ground. He died that night in terrible agony 3 miles outside Far West. The fight was over and won, and the prisoners released, but instead of exultation, the Mormons were overwhelmed with gloom. Patton, a man of great strength and courage, had been the most beloved of all the apostles. "Alas," wrote John D. Lee, "my dream of security was over. One of our mighty had fallen, and by Gentile hands." The Battle of Crooked River was reported to Governor Boggs as a massacre by the Mormons, although Bogart had actually lost but 1 man, and the Mormons 3. "The women and children are flying from Richmond in every direction," Judge Ryland wrote on the 25th of October, "and the city is expected to be sacked and burned by the Mormon banditti tonight. We have sent since 1 o'clock this evening about 100 well-armed and daring men, with the full determination to exterminate or expel them from the state en masse." On the same day that this deluge of rumor and falsehood reached him, Governor Boggs received the sworn statements of the 2 Mormon apostles, T.B. Marsh and Orson Hyde, exposing the Danites, admitting the burning and pillaging of Gallatin, and giving a detailed account of the prophet's Mohammed speech. They reported that the Danites planned to burn Richmond and Liberty and to poison the wells and food of the old settlers in an effort to start a pestilence. Even General Atchison, who until now had believed that the Mormons were entirely blameless, wrote angrily to Boggs, "From the late outrages committed by the Mormons, civil war is They have set the laws of the country at defiance and are in open rebellion." Boggs had never lifted a finger to stop the 5-year-long depredations of the old settlers against the Mormons, but this news of the first Mormon resistance galvanized him into action. He wrote to General Clark on the 27th of October, a command that was even more shocking than his past lethargy. "Your orders are to hasten your operations and endeavor to reach Richmond in Ray County with all possible speed. The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public good. Their outrages are beyond all description. Ryland's letter, the statements of Marsh and Hyde, Atchison's letter, and Boggs's exterminating order were all printed in correspondence, orders, etc. Pages 57 to 62, 76. The prophet, meanwhile, was energetically preparing far west for a siege. His men tore down cabins to build breastworks to prevent the cavalry from charging into the town, and hastily gathered in supplies of food. Blacksmith hammered out crude swords and pikes from every available piece of steel. The women packed their bags and prepared to flee with the children northward into the scanty woods. Joseph walked about the town, directing the measures for defense and calling out encouragement to every gloomy face. Coming upon a group of disconsolate guards shivering over a few firebrands, he caught first one and then another by the shoulders, shaking them roughly. "Get out of here, and wrestle, run, jump, do anything but move around. Warm yourselves up," he cried. "This inactivity will not do for soldiers." Forming them into a ring, he stepped inside and challenged them to wrestle. Catching his spirit, the men one by one stepped into the ring to try their strength, while the others shouted and applauded. Not one could throw Joseph, and finally, laughing and sweating, he left the ring to make way for a lesser man. As the sport went on, the crowd grew boisterous. Suddenly, Sidney Rigdon broke into the ring, sword in hand, crying testily, "You are breaking the Sabbath, and I'll not suffer it." For a moment the men were abashed and silent. Then one bolder than the rest called to the prophet, who had been watching Rigdon with a curious expression, "Brother Joseph, we want you to clear us from blame, for we formed the ring by your request. You told us to wrestle, and now Brother Rigdon is bringing us to account for it." "Brother Sidney," Joseph answered deliberately, walking into the ring, "you had better get out of here and let the boys alone. They are amusing themselves according to my orders." "You are an old man. You go and get ready for meeting and let the boys alone." Then, catching Rigdon off guard, he knocked the sword from his hand and caught him by the shoulder. "Now, old man, you must go out, or I will throw you down." John D. Lee, who was watching the spectacle, said that the prospect of a tussle between the prophet and the mouthpiece of the prophet was fun for all but Rigdon, who pulled back like a crawfish. Joseph knocked off his hat, dragged him bodily out of the ring, and with one jerk of his wrist, ripped his fine pulpit coat from the collar to the waist. Then, turning to the men, he said, "Go in, boys, and have your fun. You shall never have it to say that I got you into any trouble that I did not get you out of." When Rigdon began whimpering about the loss of his coat, Joseph said, "You were out of your place. Always keep your place, and you will not suffer. You have no one to blame but yourself." "After that," said Lee, "Rigdon never countermanded the orders of the prophet, to my knowledge. He knew who was boss." By the 29th of October, all the outlying Mormon settlements had been evacuated except one. On a creek, several miles from Far West, Jacob Hahn had just finished building a flour mill, which he swore he would not desert to a Gentile arsonist. "You had better lose your property than your lives," the prophet told him. But Hahn was unconvinced. When he departed, Joseph turned to Lyman White and John D. Lee, gravely troubled. "I wish they were here for their own safety. I am confident they will be butchered in the most fearful manner." On the 30th of October, the Mormon scouts and picket guards were driven into Far West by the approach of a large body of militia. Colonel Hinkle, who was in command of the Mormon troops, had been out with the scouts, one of whom noted that when they were most hotly pursued by the militia, Hinkle had turned his coat inside out. This act was reported to Joseph with a warning. "He's a fair-weather saint, and you'd best watch him close. John D." Lee heard the prophet thank the scout for the information and warn him to keep it secret. "It's a bad time," he said, "to ventilate an act like that." The Mormon force guarding Far West was about 800 strong. It was badly armed, many of the men having no muskets, being armed only with single-shot pistols or homemade swords. But there was considerable ammunition, and the morale of the men was high. Now, Father wrote one Mormon in a letter on the 28th of October, "Come to Zion and fight for the religion of Jesus. Many a hoary head is engaged here. The prophet goes out to the battle as in days of old. He has the sword that Nephi Is not this marvelous? Brother Winchester letter, written serially between the 6th of September and the 19th of November 1838, copied into the journal history under the date the 19th of November. The militia halted just outside range of the Mormon guns, and the two forces watched each other warily. During this time, a messenger from General Doniphan slipped into Far West with a message for the prophet. It was a copy of Boggs's exterminating order. The note said further that the dreaded Samuel Lucas, armed with this order, was on his way to Far West with General Clark and 6,000 men. That night a wounded man stumbled into Far West with news that froze the blood of every saint. The settlement at Haun's Mill had been attacked by 200 militiamen. The Mormons had fled into the blacksmith shop, which they thought would make an admirable fort, but it had proved instead to be a slaughterhouse. Great cracks yawned between the logs of the shop, and the Missourians, hiding behind trees, picked off the Mormons at their leisure as if they had been killing cattle in a pen. When the women fled toward the brush, the men shot at them in derision. Old Thomas McBride fell wounded and surrendered his gun, whereupon one of the mob coolly hacked him to pieces with a corn cutter. After shooting down every Mormon they could see, the mob entered the blacksmith shop to finish off the wounded. They found 9-year-old Sardius Smith hiding under the bellows. His younger brother, shot through the hip, and pretending to be dead, heard the men drag Sardius out from his hiding place. "Don't shoot," said one militiaman. "It's just a boy." "It's best to hive them when we can. Nits will make lice," a man replied, and placing his rifle near the boy's head, blew out his brains. When darkness came, the women crept back to the scene of carnage. Of the 38 men and boys in the camp, 17 had been slain and 15 wounded. Fearful that the mob would return, the women lowered the dead into an unfinished well, hid the wounded in the woods, and then, stunned and desolate, made their way toward Far West. As news of the massacre spread among the saints, the men cursed as they had not cursed since they joined the church. But everywhere there was a deep conviction that the Haun's Mill colony would have been spared had Haun heeded the prophet. There was no sleep for Joseph that night. He could not help feeling answerable for the horror. And in Far West he could see on the morrow a Haun's Mill massacre repeated 100 times. His scouts were hourly bringing him reports. The militia was doubling, trebling. Already the saints were outnumbered 5 to 1 in fighting men, and within 2 days 10,000 men would surround the town. Joseph knew his own men well. He could list the lily-livered on his fingers and call the "oh, don't" men by their first names. Sending secretly for John Corrill and Reed Peck, dissenters whom Doniphan knew and respected, he said to them, "Find General Doniphan and beg like a dog for peace." Reed Peck manuscript, page 103. But, knowing that his overtures might be spurned, and that any hint of capitulation would demoralize his men and bring the militia whooping into the town, he played out his role of magnificent resistance to the end. When his men gathered before him the next morning, he met them with resolution and complete self-assurance. "I care not a fig for the coming of the troops. We've tried long enough to please the Gentiles. If we live together, they don't like it. If we scatter, they massacre us for it. The only law they know here is that might makes right. They are a damned set, and God will blast them into hell. If they try to attack us, we will play hell with their apple carts. Before now, men, you fought like devils. But now I want you to fight like angels, for angels can whip devils. And for everyone we lack in number to match the mob, the Lord will send an angel to fight alongside." As reported by George Henkel, James C. Owens, Samuel Kinnebel, and Samson Avard in Correspondence, Orders, etc. Their accounts were confirmed by E. Robinson in The Return, Volume 2, January 1890, page 206. Before the day was over, Corrill and Peck returned with word that Major General Lucas, who was in command, was willing to meet the leading elders of Far West under a flag of truce between the lines. Shortly afterward, a delegation of militiamen approached with a white flag, and Joseph sent to meet Lieutenant Colonel Hinkle, Corrill, Peck, W. W. Phelps, and John Clemenson, all of whom he suspected of turning against him. A compromise must be made on some terms, he said, honorable or dishonorable. See the Reed Peck manuscript, pages 108 to 9, and a letter from George Hinkle to W. W. Phelps, dated the 14th of August, 1844, published in the Messenger and Advocate, Pittsburgh, the 1st of August, 1845. Lucas's terms were harsh. He demanded, first, the surrender of the Mormon leaders to be tried for treason; second, the confiscation of all Mormon property, to liquidate Mormon debts, and to indemnify the old settlers whose property had been damaged; third, the immediate mass migration of all Mormons from the state; and fourth, the surrender of their arms. The alternative to these terms was annihilation. Hinkle requested a 12-hour delay, but Lucas insisted on having Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Lyman White, Parley Pratt, and George Robinson as hostages. If by morning the Mormons still wanted to fight, he said he would guarantee the prisoners' release. When Joseph heard the terms, he called in his leading men who were in most imminent peril, chiefly those who had figured in the battle with Bogart's men, and bade them flee northward out of the state. He ordered all the plunder taken from the Gentiles gathered together in one house, lest every man who was found with a saddle or a blanket not his own be hanged for stealing. Chapter 17. Ordeal in Liberty Jail. At dawn the prisoners heard the rattle of arms and watched General Doniphan form his brigade. No Missourian had befriended the Mormons with such singleness of purpose and peculiar constancy. It was he whom Lucas had ordered to carry out the execution. When the line was formed, Doniphan walked over to the prisoners, his massive head and lean figure outlined in the growing light. "By God," he said without preamble, "you have been sentenced by the court-martial to be shot this morning, but I will be damned if I will have any of the honor of it or any of the disgrace of it. I have ordered my brigade to take up the line of march and to leave the camp, for I consider it to be cold-blooded murder." With a gesture of farewell, he strode away and marched his men off briskly. This insubordination threw the whole camp into confusion. Lucas called a second court-martial and read to the other generals Doniphan's defiant message. "It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. My brigade shall march for liberty tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God." After some debate, Lucas suggested holding the execution in Independence. Doniphan's threat had given him pause, and but he was determined at least to parade the captive prophet before his saints, and marched back to Far West in an arrogant gesture of triumph. This was the bitterest day Far West would ever see. Before the surrender there had been terror, but terror matched by courage and a steadfast resolve to die for the prophet's sake. Now there was only despair. The men slowly stacked their arms in the public square, and stood in line to sign away their property to pay for a war that had been none of their making. The women crowded about the prison wagon, watching in silence the anguished leave-taking of the prisoners and their wives. Joseph's mother pushed her way through the crowd as the prison wagon was about to leave, reached through the canvas, and caught her son by the hand. He did not speak. "Joseph," she cried out at last, "I cannot bear to go until I hear your voice." "God bless you, mother," he answered thickly, as the driver whipped up his horses and galloped them out of the city. Then the militia went wild. According to Mormon accounts, 6,000 men visited Far West in 1 week. They left nothing. Hogs and cattle they shot for sport, reducing the Mormons who had been forbidden to leave the city to a diet of parched corn. The leading elders whom Joseph had warned to flee were hunted down like prairie wolves, and those who resisted capture were shot. Rape went hand in hand with plunder. Several girls were bound to the benches in the schoolhouse and violated by a score of men. After 6 days of this sport, General Clark ordered all the Mormon men into the public square. 56 who were under arrest he ordered off to Richmond for trial. What he said to the remainder the Mormons never forgot. "The character of this state has suffered almost beyond redemption from the character, conduct, and influence that you have exerted, and we deem it an act of justice to restore her character to its former standing among the states by every proper means. The orders of the governor to me were that you should be exterminated and not allowed to remain in the state, and had your leaders not been given up and the terms of the treaty complied with before this, you and your families would have been destroyed. I do not say that you shall go now, but you must not think of staying here another or of putting in crops, for the moment you do this, the citizens will be upon you. As for your leaders, their doom is sealed. You have always been the aggressors. You have brought upon yourselves these difficulties by being disaffected and not being subject to rule. And my advice is that you become as others, lest by a recurrence of these events you bring upon yourselves irretrievable ruin. Reprinted in History of Caldwell and Livingston Counties, St. Louis, 1886, page 540. On the way to independence, Joseph began to hope that he and his friends might escape execution altogether. "Be of good cheer, brethren," he encouraged. "The word of the Lord came to me last night, that our lives should be given us." But the threat of death was still so perilously close that when he wrote to Emma just before reaching independence, he could not mask his foreboding. "O Emma, for God's sake, do not forsake me nor the truth, but remember me. If I do not meet you again in this life, may God grant that we may meet in heaven. I cannot express my feelings, my heart is full. Farewell, O my kind and affectionate Emma, I am yours forever, your husband and true friend." This letter is in the library of the Reorganized Church, Independence, Missouri. There he learned that he was to be sent back to Richmond to stand trial in a civil court for treason, murder, arson, burglary, robbery, larceny, and perjury. Generals Lucas and Clark had finally been made to see that executing a civilian illegally would have unpleasant consequences. In the Richmond jail, the prisoners were chained together on the floor of a bare cell. Rigdon had contracted a fever from exposure, and the acute tension under which he was suffering brought back his old nervous spasms and fainting. The guards mocked at his delirium and baited the others with tales of the looting, murder, and raping they had done at Far West. Parley Pratt was lying next to the prophet late one night when these stories became so foul that he could not close his ears to them. Suddenly, he said, Joseph rose and spoke in a voice of thunder. "Silence, ye fiends of the infernal pit! In the name of Jesus Christ I rebuke you, and command you to be still. I will not live another minute and hear such language. Cease such talk, or you or I die this instant." The guards turned away, abashed and half scared. Pratt was overwhelmed. "I have seen ministers of justice," he wrote later in his autobiography, "clothed in magisterial robes and criminals arraigned before them while life was suspended on a breath. But dignity and majesty have I seen but once, as it stood in chains at midnight in a dungeon in an obscure village in Missouri. After 5 days the men were unshackled and taken into court. There Joseph was chilled at what he saw. His judge was Austin A. King, who but a week before had demonstrated his impartiality by publishing a letter in the Missouri Argus accusing the Mormons of arson and murder. This letter, dated Richmond the 24th of October, 1838, almost every man who might have testified in his favor had been arrested and was on trial. Joseph found missing among them the wily Brigham Young, the gentle Edward Partridge, and the clowning Heber Kimball. They alone had escaped the dragnet. His eyes settled finally on the witnesses for the state. Among them were the men who had arranged the truce, Corral, Hinkle, Phelps, and Peck. John Whitmer had joined them. But the greatest shock was the sight of Samson Avard, arrogant as ever, sitting in the witness box, the star performer for the prosecution. Avard showed himself for what he was, an opportunist and a coward. He told everything, the founding of the Danites, the expulsion of the dissenters, the looting of Gallatin and Millport, whitewashing himself as best he could, and heaping blame upon Rigdon and the prophet. As a final triumphant gesture, he produced a document that he said was the Danite Constitution, complete with a list of Danite offices which included a Secretary of War. This the lawyers pounced upon as evidence of treason against the state. The prophet Daniel had once spoken of a stone that rolled down a mountain, smashing everything in its path, a symbol of God's kingdom, which would one day demolish all earthly governments. Avard, Corral, and John Whitmer all testified that the Mormon Church had been likened to this stone. Avard swore that Lyman Wight had prophesied that the stone would destroy first the dissenters, then Missouri, then the United States, whose core was rotten. The complete court record of this trial was published in Correspondence, Orders, etc., and was also printed as United States Senate Document 189, 26th Congress, 2nd Session, the 15th of February, 1841. Marsh and Hyde had sworn earlier that Joseph intended to take the United States and ultimately the whole world. Ibidem, pages 57-9. As Joseph listened, he realized that Judge King was trying to draw out evidence that the Mormons had set up a kingdom. Until this could be established, the charge of treason was ridiculous. But though the apostates agreed in most details about the Danites and the Mormon plundering, they could offer nothing but rumors about the temporal nature of Joseph's kingdom of God upon earth. Soon, militiamen were called to the stand, the majority of whom were so illiterate they could not sign their own testimonies. They complained chiefly of petty thievery and burned cabins, bickering a good deal over identification of the Mormons who had done the raiding. No one remembered seeing the prophet on any raid. Donovan, who was lawyer for the Mormons, tried desperately to get his own witnesses on the stand. But it soon became common knowledge that the moment a Mormon witness was named, Captain Bogart hunted him down and arrested him. The defense could muster only 6, 3 of them women, and these were stifled by the judge almost as soon as they began to talk. Donovan finally gave up. "If a cohort of angels were to come down and declare you innocent," he said to Joseph, "it would make no difference, for King is determined to see you in prison." King was sitting only as a committing magistrate and made no effort to decide on the prisoner's guilt. He released or admitted to bail all the Mormons but 10. 4 were kept in Richmond jail. The other 6, including Rigdon and the prophet, were sent to Liberty Jail in Clay County. All were denied writs of habeas corpus, and none was permitted to give bail. Joseph entered the cramped stone cell of Liberty Jail on the 30th of November, 1838. 4 months passed before his trial. He bore his imprisonment stoically, almost cheerfully, for there was a serenity in his nature that enabled him to accept trouble along with glory. For the first time in years, he had ample leisure for meditation, and the sobering and maturing influence of his enforced idleness can clearly be seen in the series of remarkable letters he dictated to his people and various friends. In his first letter he denounced Colonel Hinkle as a traitor who had decoyed him unaware, as the Savior was led into the camp of his enemies, as a lamb prepared for the slaughter, as a sheep dumb before his shearers. This was the beginning of the legend of the great betrayal, which made the name of Hinkle synonymous with Judas among the Mormons. Then Joseph took up the charges leveled against him by the old settlers, answering them with skill and tact, for he knew himself to be on trial before his own people. Brigham Young had brought word that many saints believed him a fallen prophet. Isaac Russell had already set up a little reform church, and Young had had to defend the prophet before the High Council. History of the Church, Volume 3, pages 2246 hard. Of all, for Young to silence had been William Smith, and Brigham winced every time he remembered the hot-headed youth saying that he hoped Joseph would never get out of the hands of his enemies alive. "If I had the disposing of my brother," William had shouted, "I would have hung him years ago." See Young's statement in the Millennial Star, Volume 27, the 21st of October, 1865, page 658. Joseph now wrote to his people a defense and an apology. He did not deny responsibility for the Danites, but blamed Avard for teaching many false and pernicious things, of which he had been ignorant as well as innocent. Then, oddly, he chose to deny the ubiquitous rumor of polygamy, though it had not been mentioned in the Richmond trial. Finally, he answered the acclamation that he was a fallen prophet. "The keys of the kingdom have not been taken away from us, for verily thus saith the Lord, be of good cheer. For the keys that I gave unto you are yet with you. Zion shall yet live, though she seem to be dead." History of the Church, Volume 3, pages 226-33. Meanwhile, the torpid Missouri conscience was beginning to stir, when a liberal St. Louis newspaper, the Missouri Republican Daily, published details of the Haun's Mill massacre. Shocked legislators from that area clamored for an investigation. Letters appeared in the Republican demanding an appropriation for the Mormons' rehabilitation, as their desperate plight finally won publicity. The Republican exposed also the shameful story of the Daviess County land sales. With the evacuation of Adamantiaman, the old settlers had organized a public auction. The town was real loot, for it had an admirable site, and everywhere half-built cabins and granaries bespoke once high hopes and incredible industry. The whole Mormon acreage with fences, buildings, and improvements had sold for $1.25 per acre. It would seem, said the editor flatly, that the Mormon oppressors got up this crusade in order to obtain possession of the houses and lands of their victims. See Missouri Republican Daily, the 12th of December, 13. The Missouri legislature seethed and stuttered. After some pressure, Boggs presented the documents concerning the Mormon War, which were referred to the Turner Committee for study with a view to their publication. This was the beginning of one of the most egregious whitewashings in the history of American state politics. The Turner Committee saw at once that it was handling dynamite. The evidence attempting to prove the Mormon leaders guilty of treason was flimsy. The testimonies given at the Richmond trial established the fact of the Danite organization, but for all its tyranny, it scarcely had the odor of a revolutionary conspiracy. Even the much-touted Danite Constitution turned out to be relatively innocuous. The burnings and pillaging indulged in by the Mormons paled into nothingness beside the hideous story of Haun's Mill, and the governor's exterminating order stank to heaven. It was common knowledge that one member of the legislature had participated in the Haun's Mill massacre, and the Republican now accused him of wanting all the facts suppressed. Point 1 bid. The 12th of November, 1838. But no member of the Turner Committee needed pressure to convince him that Missouri's honor was at stake. The decision was unanimous against publication of the documents. On the day following Turner's report, John Corriel read to the Assembly a petition from the Mormon people. It was a melancholy catalogue of abuses, ending with a heartrending plea for justice. Although Corriel was denouncing the Mormon leaders, he had chosen to champion the cause of the saints themselves, and the legislators listened with respect. Then followed an acrimonious debate, which continued intermittently for weeks, until the editor of the Republican wrote in exasperation on the 4th of February, 1839, "The very members who first cried loudest for investigation have solemnly declared that they will have no investigation." The exterminating order was not rescinded. In late December, to aid the Mormons in their departure, the Assembly appropriated $2,000. The niggardliness of this sum was thrown into bold relief not long after when the legislature voted $200,000 to Far West by this time had found a new leader. It was the one piece of luck in a whole avalanche of misfortune that Brigham Young had managed to keep out of jail. More than anything else, the Mormons needed a man who looked at their exodus in terms of the supply problem. Young went to work with vigor that swept apathy and despair before it like a tidy broom. At his insistence, 200 of the best-equipped families pooled all their food and equipment to be used for the common good. He dispatched emissaries ahead to make deposits of corn along the route and to negotiate contracts for ferrage. In mid-February, he was forced to flee to Illinois to escape arrest, but his foresight was already bearing fruit. The saints endured much suffering in the Exodus, but luckily the season was stormless, and the frozen roads were relatively passable. "The word impossible has become obsolete with us," Eliza Snow wrote to a friend late in February. "It astonishes our enemies that our people suffer no more while passing through. They say that the Mormons are so jerd sure of going to heaven, they had as life to die as not." Estimates of the total number of Mormons expelled from Missouri varied all the way from the 8,000 of Eliza Snow to the exaggerated claim of 50,000 made in a rash moment by the prophet. See the letter of Eliza Snow to Esquire Streeter, dated the 22nd of February, 1839, now in the Western Reserve Historical Society Library, Cleveland. Joseph's estimate was made in a letter to Isaac Galland, written from Liberty Jail, and published in Times and Seasons, Volume 1, page 52. Although Mormon historians generally estimate the number at 12,000 to 15,000, they insist that no more than 800 men were under arms at Far West. Most of the Mormons stopped at Quincy, across the Mississippi River in Illinois, where the citizens extended charity and sympathy. There was a chronic border friction between Missouri and Illinois, and the suckers welcomed the chance to demonstrate a nobility of character foreign to the despised Pukes. More important, a presidential election was in the offing, and the Democratic Association, which controlled the votes in the Quincy area, was eager to make friends with this huge new voting bloc. Fearful lest the Mormons turn Whig in bitterness against the Democratic government in Missouri, they solicited funds for relieving the Mormons' distress and did their best to provide housing. Despite this hospitality, it was clear to everyone that Quincy could absorb but a fraction of the destitute people. The Mormons were faced with the choice of either scattering widely or purchasing as a group several thousand acres of land on credit. The whole frontier tradition encouraged the former, but Joseph's priesthood had become a cohesive power that could not be dissolved by a word. Moreover, suffering had made these people kin. Real estate speculators in Illinois looked upon the Mormons as the fairest game that had ever come into the state. Long before all the fugitives had crossed the river, Isaac Galland offered a 20,000-acre tract lying between the Mississippi and Des Moines rivers in the Iowa Territory at $2 an acre, the sum to be paid in 20 annual installments without interest. This was a part of the half-breed tract which had been set aside by the federal government for the offspring of the mixed marriages common in that area. The half-breeds, with a calculating insouciance, had sold and resold their claims for guns and horses, frequently selling the same claim to a half-dozen different bidders by using forged deeds. The worth of Galland's title to any part of the tract was extremely dubious. History of Lee Company, Iowa, 1879, pages 164. But the Mormons were as ignorant of this as of Galland's checkered past. His home county in Illinois, Hancock, knew him as a horse thief and counterfeiter. When he had campaigned for the legislature in 1834, he had openly admitted his association with the notorious Massac criminals, and many voters had been so amused by his honest admission of his dishonesty. Thomas Ford, History of Illinois, Chicago, 1854, page 406. Posing now as a sympathizer and probable convert, Galland wrote to the prophet in Liberty Jail. Impressed, as always, by a facile tongue, Joseph replied with enthusiasm to Galland's commiseration and unctuous praise, and expressed his interest in the tract. See his letter to Galland, Times and Seasons, Volume 1, 1840, page 52. Thus it came about that in the first weeks of their arrival in Illinois, the Mormons began not only to be entangled in a net of fraudulent land deals, but also to be sucked into the maelstrom of local politics. Joseph's lonely months in Liberty Jail were punctuated by occasional moments of pleasure and excitement. In the beginning he had visitors. Brigham Young came as often as he dared. Young Porter Rockwell, who had tagged the prophet ever since his early conversion in New York State, appointed himself a guardian and hung about the jail like a shaggy and dangerous watchdog, occasionally bringing the prisoners food and keeping them informed of local happenings. Rockwell, who had the face of a mastiff and the strength of a bear, was a jocose and amiable companion, who lightened the hours with his gossip and earthy humor. The guards good-humoredly tolerated him, unaware of his fabulous skill with a gun and the fierceness of his love for Joseph. Emma visited the jail twice before leaving the state, bringing the 6-year-old Joseph with her. These visits were happy, tender hours, marred only by the swiftness of their passing. When Joseph bade his wife and son a final farewell, he pronounced a blessing upon young Joseph's head with a sad solemnity, which the boy never forgot. Memoirs of President Joseph Smith, 1832 to 1914. Saints Herald, Volume 88, 1, the 6th of November, 1934, page 1414. Their departure for Illinois left Joseph with a melancholia which he could not shake off. As the weeks dragged by, and it seemed increasingly clear that Joseph and his fellow prisoners were not going to be brought to trial, he lost all faith in Donovan and the other lawyers, to whom he had guaranteed fees now amounting to $16,000. According to George A. Smith, Journal of Discourses, Volume 13, October 1868, page 109, who met all his pleas with postponements, there seemed no hope save in an attempted break. The men planned one night to overpower the jailer when he brought their supper. But by a coincidence, 6 friends arrived for a visit that same evening, and the jailer brought extra guards. Hiram rushed the jailer as he was admitting the visitors, but in the resulting confusion, the friends, who were ignorant of the plans, proved more hindrance than aid, and 1 guard escaped and slammed the heavy door shut. The visitors, who were promptly arrested, now looked helplessly to Joseph for advice. He advised each man to plead his own case, and when one protested, "But I don't understand the law," Joseph said wryly, "Well, go and plead for justice as hard as you can, and quote Blackstone now and then, and they will take it all for law." As related by one of the prisoners, Alexander McCrae, in the Deseret News, the 9th of October, the 1st of November, 1854, after some weeks the prisoners made a second attempt to win their freedom, this time by loosening the stones and timber in the prison wall. They used smuggled augers for tools, but the timber was tough, and the auger handles gave way before the last stone was pried loose. When Rockwell tried to supply them with new tools, the guards became suspicious and discovered the hole. "It was a fine breach," Joseph wrote afterward with satisfaction, "and cost the county a round sum." To the dirty food, unsanitary and crowded quarters, and the fear of lynching was added a new horror when someone smuggled lead poison into the tea and coffee. McCrae, who drank neither beverage, escaped, but all who drank them, he said, were sorely afflicted, some being blind 2 or 3 days, and it was only by much faith and prayer that the effect was overcome. The prison discomforts were borne with fortitude by all the men except Rigdon. His frequent fits were followed by periods of whining that wore on the nerves of the younger men. When on the 25th of February, Donovan finally succeeded in getting him released on a writ of habeas corpus, the others watched his departure with relief. Joseph, whose disillusionment with the older man was now complete, wrote in his journal with contempt. He said that the sufferings of Jesus Christ were a fool to him. Glad as he was to be rid of him as a prison companion, the prophet was disquieted by thoughts of what Rigdon would do with the saints in Illinois, and took immediate steps to curb his authority. "Beware of a fanciful and flowery and heated imagination," he wrote to his brethren, and ordered that the affairs of the church be transacted by a general conference rather than a single man. Fearful lest Rigdon try to revive the United Order in the Danites, he forbade the organization of large bodies upon common stock principles in property or of large companies of firms, and warned against the impropriety of the organization of bands or companies by covenants or oaths, by penalties or secrecies. History of the Church, Volume 3, pages 295, 301, 303. Although Joseph for the first time had the leisure to take stock of his past errors, he wasted little time in self-reproach, and began spinning the pattern of an even more complicated metaphysics. "Whether there be one God or many gods, they shall be manifest," he wrote to his brethren, suggesting the richness of revelations to come. "All thrones and dominions, principalities and powers shall be revealed. Also, if there be bounds set to the heavens, or to the seas, or to the dry land, or to the sun, moon, or stars, all their glories, laws, and set times shall be revealed. But this time," he decided, "there should be no casting of pearls before swine. Only those men who had proved their loyalty in the crucible of suffering should be privileged to hear the great mysteries of the kingdom." This would be particularly true of his new patriarchal order of marriage, vulgarly referred to by his enemies as a community of wives. It is doubtful if Joseph was yet clear in his own mind about just what the ideal marriage order should be, but his long absence from Emma, and his vivid memory of the charming girls who idolized him from a respectful distance, Eliza Snow, who wrote long poems in his glory, Louisa Beeman, full-breasted and disturbingly beautiful, the fiery Nancy Rigdon, who had testified in his favor with such girlish vehemence at the Richmond trial, served now to intensify his certainty that there was a celestial marriage law specially designed for the glory of his brethren. Perhaps he remembered his months in Far West at the home of Lucinda Morgan Harris, who told a friend in later years that she had been the prophet's mistress, and concluded that married women as well as virgins must be privileged to join his own circle of spiritual wives. Queenly young Prescindia Huntington Buell, whose husband had turned against the church, paid him a visit in jail in February. When she came a second time in March and was turned away by the jailer, he wrote her a cryptic and tender letter, in which he hinted of a great plan that he would soon unfold to his most faithful followers. Letter to Mrs. Norman Bull, Sick, History of the Church, Volume 3, pages 285-6. Lucinda Harris and Pressendia Buell are both listed by Mormon historians as plural wives of Joseph. See Appendix C. Joseph's dreams of empire and indulgence were a natural consequence of brooding over his people's suffering and the injustice of his own imprisonment. But there was an intensity in his imagination that transformed the baseless fabric of his reverie into magnificent conviction. "How long can rolling water remain impure?" he wrote. "What power shall stay the heavens? As well might man stretch forth his puny arm to stop the Missouri River in its decreed course, or to turn it upstream as to hinder the Almighty from pouring down knowledge from heaven upon the heads of the Latter-day Saints. What is Boggs or his murderous party but wimbling willows upon the shore to catch the flood wood?" As well might we argue that water is not water, because the mountain torrents send down mire and roil the crystal stream, as to say that our cause is down because renegados, liars, priests, thieves, and murderers, who are all alike tenacious of their crafts and creeds, have poured down from their spiritual wickedness in high places, and from their strongholds of the devil, a flood of dirt and mire and filthiness and vomit upon our heads. No, God forbid. Hell may pour forth its rage like the burning lava of Mount Vesuvius, or of Etna, or of the most terrible of the burning mountains, and yet shall Mormonism stand. Water, fire, truth, and God are all realities. Truth is Mormonism. God is the author of it. These extracts are from a letter written the 25th of March, 5839. See History of the Church, Volume 3, pages 289-305. As the days wore on, and the frenzied hatred of the old settlers died down, the prisoners became more and more of an embarrassment to the local officials, who were reluctant to bring them to trial lest they be forced to acquit them. Finally, on the 6th of April, 1839, Joseph and his men were taken from Liberty Jail and hurried off to Daviess County, the seat of their alleged crimes. Fearing a rescue party, the guard made a wide detour to avoid Far West, and finally deposited the prisoners in the Gallatin schoolhouse. 6 months earlier, Joseph's presence would have been an invitation to hanging, but since the exodus of the Mormons, the old settlers had returned to their careless and amiable ways. Having won the war and expropriated the Mormon property, they no longer were concerned over a handful of lives. By day, the schoolhouse was full of visitors, curious and not unfriendly. Joseph's lawyer, Peter Burnett, noted that Lyman White, whose fierceness had become legendary, was a great favorite. He drank freely with his guards and discussed the recent battles with complete good nature and frankness. "There you rather whipped us," he would admit with a roar of laughter, "but here we licked you fair." Recollections and Opinions of an Old Pioneer, New York, 1880, page 65. Burnett later went west and became the first governor of the state of California. The prophet and White talked incessantly, Burnett said, and did not sleep at all for several nights. It was not because they had no cots or because the floor they were expected to sleep on was thick with mud, for Liberty Jail had been no luxury palace, but rather that the breath of freedom was in their nostrils. Though lean and emaciated from their long idleness and foul food, they had watched the clouds from a horse's saddle instead of through a rusty grate, and were infused with a wild new strength. Burnett reported that almost everyone at the trial was drunk, except Joseph, who, though he passed around as much liquor as anyone, kept sober the whole time. Joseph's counsel argued for a change of venue to another county, since it was impossible to get a panel of 12 men in Daviess County who had not been implicated in the Mormon War. The lawyers won their point, and with it Joseph's freedom, for he knew he could never again return to prison and listen to the tortuous creaking of the machinery of Missouri justice. His lieutenants in the brush were eager to waylay the guard. "If you take a change of venue," Allinson Ripley had written to him, "let me know what county you will come to, and when, as near as possible, and what road you will come, for I shall be an adder in the path." History of the Church, Volume 3, page 313. Adder in the path. is part of the biblical passage from which the name Danites evolved. As it turned out, Joseph did not need a rescue party. On the way to Boone County, Hiram bought a jug of whiskey sweetened with honey. To this proprietary offering, Joseph added a bribe of $800. Memoirs of President Joseph Smith, Saints Herald, Volume 80 AT, the 13th of November, 1934, page 1454. Young Joseph remembered the sheriff coming to collect the $800 from his father. For the vicinity of the escape, see Hiram Smith's account, History of the Church, Volume 3, page 321N. It was enough. The sheriff obligingly sold them several of the horses, and about 25 miles from Adamon-the-Ammon, obviously close to Far West, the guard got drunk and went conveniently to sleep. Joseph mounted a fine dark chestnut stallion, and with the other prisoners close behind him, pounded up the road toward his old settlement, where he joined the last remnant of the Mormons who were headed for the Mississippi. Chapter 18. Nauvoo. There are more bends in the Mississippi than even a river rat can remember, with every spring flood erasing some of the old and creating a score of new. But the bend that the Mormons made famous is likely to be as permanent a landmark as any on this fabulous river's course. It lies halfway down the state of Illinois, not far north of and across the river from Keokuk in Iowa. The riverbank rises gently here to a point so high that one standing on its summit can see the river cutting a great silver semicircle at one's feet. When Joseph Smith stood on this hill after his escape from Missouri in 1839, the spot was wooded and trackless, and swamps covered the lowlands behind him. But he could see the glistening river, with its islands lying to the north like lush garden places, and the green Iowa hills beyond. "It is a beautiful sight," he said fervently, "and it shall be called Nauvoo, which means in Hebrew a beautiful plantation." Professor Lewis C. Zucker of the University of Utah has carefully documented Joseph Smith's indebtedness to his Hebrew teacher Joshua Seixas. See his unpublished Mormon and Jew, A Meeting on the American Frontier. Nauvoo had the melancholy music of a mourning dove's call, and somehow matched the magic of the site. The city saw a growth even more spectacular than had Far West. It was laid out in neat squares, like a checkerboard shaped to fit a hill, with the square on the summit set aside for a temple. Almost at one breath it swallowed up the handful of nearby cabins known as commerce, whose streets were resurveyed and widened to conform to Joseph's ideal city plan. Within a year after the prophet's coming, Nauvoo boasted 250 houses, with scores more buildings. The timber had been felled, the swamps drained, and the cornerstones laid for an immense temple. Neatly fenced farms fanned out from the city across what had been scrub woods and marsh. The year took a grievous toll of life. Weakened by a winter of hunger and exposure, the saints fell easy victim to an epidemic of ague, perhaps typhoid or malaria, and died like flies in the frost. Joseph and Emma gave up their house to the sick and lived in a tent. Emma, who had considerable fame as an herb doctor, went among the stricken administering Sappington's pills, Dover's powders, and various of her own medicines, although she had not yet fully recovered from the birth of a new son, Don Carlos. Cries for Joseph's prayers were so insistent that at the height of the epidemic he spent most of his days making the rounds of the sick. Usually his mere presence was enough to bring some relief, and occasionally he made spectacular healings. Parley Pratt walked with him one day to the home of Elijah Fordham, who lay swathed in poultices and almost unconscious. His eyes were sunk in their sockets, Pratt wrote in his autobiography. His flesh was gone, and the paleness of death was upon him. "Do you have faith enough to be healed?" Joseph asked him. "I fear it is too late," Fordham replied weakly. "If you had come sooner, I think I would have been healed." Taking him by the hand, the prophet cried out in a voice that shook the house, "In the name of Jesus Christ, arise and walk." Whereupon, said Pratt, the man leaped from his bed, shook off the poultices and bandages from his feet, put on his clothes so quick that none got a chance to assist him, and taking a cup of tea and a little refreshment, he walked with us from house to house visiting other sick beds. Joseph described no healings in his journal. For every success there were too many failures, and he could not reproach his people with lack of faith. Eventually, the pestilence spent itself, and with the passing of years the stories of Joseph's healings multiplied. It was said that when he was worn out with praying for the sick, he gave his handkerchief to Wilford Woodruff and told him to wipe the faces of the stricken children, who were thereby saved in scores. Before another year had passed, sickness made its first inroads upon the Smith family. First Joseph's father died, then his younger brother Don Carlos, and finally his newest son, who had been named Don Carlos after his uncle. Despite these sorrows, Joseph was planning with undiminished vigor. There was an urgency in his exhortations which had a deeper cause than mere release from the stifling inactivity of Liberty Jail. Joseph had come too close to death ever again to live in easy security. He knew now that persecution was as inevitable as the sunrise, and that to it the only answer was power. He intended to make of his church a political force that would command deference and a military force that would maintain peace. Since he could have neither political nor military power without numbers, he pushed the missionary campaign with a strenuousness that dismayed the sick and poverty-ridden. The 12 apostles had been ordered off to Europe in the summer of 1839, though their cabins were unfinished and several were ill with ague. Brigham Young, gaunt in suffering, had taken leave of his destitute family and started off without strength or money. No one but Joseph could have persuaded him to leave under such wretched circumstances. With prodigious exertion, he had brought the saints out of Missouri and had labored the whole winter to keep them from starving. They had learned to run to him for counsel and had obeyed him implicitly even after Rigdon's arrival. Although Brigham Young was born to command men, he had not tasted the sweetness of such power before and was loath to relinquish it. Joseph, however, had been eager to recover the prestige and authority that was his in Far West's palmy days. He had seized the reins and held them. Rigdon, feeble and emaciated from his months in jail and prey to every chill and fever that swept through Nauvoo, had been no rival. The prophet predicted that Nauvoo would soon become the biggest city west of the Appalachians. Although it was above some river rapids which prevented the largest steamers from going north of Warsaw, he planned to remedy this by building a wing dam in the Mississippi, which would also make an ideal harbor and furnish water power for Nauvoo industry. Until it could be built, he decided to have a Mormon port in Warren, just south of Warsaw, which could easily be connected with Nauvoo by rail. Warsaw was jealous of the phenomenal Mormon city, fearful lest the new sect snatch all the political offices of Hancock County and rob her of her trade. Mormon occupation of Warren was a grave threat to Warsaw's prosperity, since the Warsaw harbor was filling up with sandbars, and Warren provided the nearest landing place. When the editor of the Warsaw newspaper learned of Mormon purchases in the vicinity, he wrote, "We sincerely hope this curse will be spared us." The Warsaw paper, however, was the only unfriendly one in. The press all over the country was sympathizing with the saints. For Joseph, resolving to make Missouri a byword for oppression and Boggs a synonym for tyranny, saw to it that the sufferings of his people received national publicity. The new Mormon paper, Times and Seasons, published eyewitness stories of the Haun's Mill massacre and exhaustive accounts of the expulsion, and copies were sent to all the leading American newspapers. Noting the success of this publicity, the editor of the Chicago Democrat wrote sagely, "We will not go so far as to call the Mormons martyrmongers, but we believe they are men of sufficient sagacity to profit by anything in the shape of persecution. The Mormons have greatly profited by their persecution in Missouri. Let Illinois repeat the bloody tragedies of Missouri, and one or two other states follow, and the Mormon religion will not only be known throughout our land, but will be very extensively embraced." The 25th of March, 1840. Determined to secure justice, Joseph started for Washington in November 1839, armed with hundreds of affidavits and petitions. "It will be a long and lonesome time during my absence from you," he wrote back to Emma, "but shall I see so many perish and not seek redress? So I will try this once in the name of the Lord." The original of this letter, dated Springfield, Illinois, the 9th of November, 1839, is on file in the library of the reorganized church. In Washington, he ran headlong into the most delicate and dangerous of all problems perplexing the American government, the issue of states' rights, which eventually he came to call a stink in the nostrils of the Almighty. The southern states were pathologically jealous of their sovereignty, and the balance between slave state and free hung by so fragile a thread that the boldest statesmen dared not tamper with it. When Joseph called on President Van Buren, he was met with complete candor on this point. "I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I shall come in contact with the whole state of Missouri." History of the Church, Volume 4, page 40. Van Buren expressed sympathy, however, as did the members of Congress whom the prophet interviewed, and promised to consider his case. But it soon became evident that with a presidential election in the offing, few politicians, and particularly few Democrats, wanted to antagonize Missouri. Joseph wrote back bitterly to Nauvoo that the ruling principles in Washington were personal aggrandizement and popular clamor. Pending the decision of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to whom the Mormon petitions were given, he went to Philadelphia to consult with Parley Pratt, leaving the details in the hands of his able lawyer, Elias Higbee. Meanwhile, the congressmen from Missouri, alarmed by Mormon demands for $2 million in damages, began feverishly talking in their own behalf. Boggs sent to Washington a transcript of the damaging testimony given at Joseph's trial in Richmond. This was printed as U.S. Senate Document 189, 26th Congress, 2nd Session, February 1841. See Higbee's letters to Joseph Smith, History of the Church, Volume 4, pages 81 to 8. This provided sufficient excuse for the Judiciary Committee to forget Boggs's exterminating order and the Haun's Mill massacre. Eventually, Higbee was informed that redress must be sought in Missouri courts. Henry Clay and John T. Stewart, Whig senator from Illinois, tried to win a hearing for the Mormon petitions on the floor of Congress, but when Joseph returned to Washington and once more appealed to Van Buren, the president replied with a phrase that typified the attitude of every American president from Van Buren to Lincoln when faced with an injustice that touched on slavery. "Sir, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you." Isaac Galland had set out to milk the Mormons dry. After getting properly baptized, he wormed his way into Joseph's confidence and became his chief land agent. Joseph had already purchased from him $8,000 worth of land in and about Nauvoo, giving him Mormon-owned Missouri land in payment. He had also exchanged Missouri land for $8,000 worth of Galland's half-breed lands in Iowa. See Galland's letter to S. Swayze, the 22nd of July, 1839, now on file in Independence, Missouri, and History of the Church, Volume 4, page 270. Galland's title to the Nauvoo tract was genuine, but his deeds to the Iowa Territory were all forged. Months passed before Galland's perfidy came to light. During this time he negotiated the purchase of 2 farms from Hugh and William White, costing $9,000, and an expensive 500-acre tract from the Hotchkiss Syndicate, costing $53,000. Notes for this property were signed by Joseph, Hiram, and Sidney Rigdon. Joseph was in absolute control of all land sales to his people. The High Council voted him treasurer of the church, and then bestowed the title of trustee in trust, with power to receive, acquire, manage, or convey property, real, personal, or mixed, for the sole use and benefit of said church. Eventually he also became Registrar of Deeds, from which position he could lay his thumb on any clandestine sales. History of the Church, Volume 1v, pages 286 to 7, 543. He fixed the average price of the Nauvoo city lot at $500. To those who had been invalided from wounds received in Missouri, he gave lots free. The attractive Sarah Cleveland, who with her husband had befriended him on his trip from Missouri to Illinois, was given a lot on the river directly across the street from his own, which fronted on the Mississippi at its most picturesque point. Ibidem, Volume 4, page 17, Volume 3, page 362. Mrs. Cleveland was later listed by Mormon historians as one of Joseph's plural wives, see Appendix C, to pay for the vast acreages he had contracted to buy. the prophet devised an ingenious system of land exchange. New converts in the East were advised to turn over their property to the church through his agents, Isaac Gallant and William Smith, who had once more been forgiven and reinstated as an apostle. These agents, in return, gave orders on land in and about Nauvoo. The eastern property was then either sold outright or transferred to the Hotchkiss Syndicate in payment on the $53,000 debt. The system had a bad defect in the high interest rate on the loans, which on the Hotchkiss purchase amounted to $6,000 in 2 years. To meet the interest, Joseph had to make considerable profit on the land he sold to his own people. As a result, the rumor that he was enriching himself on the spoils of the brethren gained such proportions that it had to be officially denied in a church conference. History of the Church, Volume 4, page 391-437. The apostate William Harris said that lots that scarcely cost him $1 are frequently sold for $1,000, Mormonism portrayed. Warsaw, Illinois, 1841, page 35. Harris's book actually was written by Thomas Sharp, in part on information provided by Harris. See the Warsaw Signal, the 11th of September, 1844. When Galland went east to pay the interest to Hotchkiss and arrange for deeding eastern lands to cover the whole debt, he absconded with the money. Joseph revoked his agency and sent out agents to catch up with him, writing to Hotchkiss in despair, "Why he has not done according to my instructions, God only knows." Eventually the man came back to Nauvoo and made some kind of restitution, but the damage inflicted on the land exchange system was irreparable. The full measure of Galland's double-dealing was not felt, however, until late in 1841, when the whole tangled litigation concerning the half-breed tract was finally straightened out, and his deeds proved worthless in the courts. Men who had escaped from Missouri and gone to Iowa with some little means were now reduced to beggary. A year's labor had been lost, and most of the 250 families that had settled across the river came back penniless to Nauvoo. Hawkeye and Patriot Montrose, Iowa, the 7th of October, 1841. Joseph continually urged the industrialization of his city. Newcomers from the East and from England were told to put their capital into mills instead of land, and Joseph set up the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association, with a capital stock of $100,000 to coordinate all Mormon economic activity. Within 2 years, the city had 2 big steam sawmills, a steam flour mill, a tool factory, and a foundry. Plans were laid for a Chinaware factory, to be manned by English converts from the Staffordshire potteries. Farmer converts who had no money for land were allowed to raise crops on a huge community farm just outside Nauvoo. Laborers and skilled craftsmen who lacked employment worked on the temple. Although their pay was uncertain and consisted of donated food and clothing, work on the huge structure was always a labor of love. All Nauvoo men were expected to spend each 10th day working there, or else to give the equivalent in goods or money. One group was sent up the Mississippi to the Wisconsin pineries, where they spent several winters cutting timber for the Lord's. Joseph's autocratic control was not, however, taken completely for granted. A city ordinance forbidding anyone to set up a business in Nauvoo without a license from the city council, which the prophet dominated, aroused so much resentment that it was repealed in May 1842. But Joseph himself felt that in matters of business, as well as the spirit, he was answerable to no one. In January 1841, he presented to the church a revelation from God, ordering the saints to build a hotel. The extraordinarily mundane details of this commandment seem not to have troubled his people. And they shall not receive less than $50 for a share of stock in that house, and they shall be permitted to receive $15,000 from any one man for stock in that house. But they shall not be permitted to receive over $15,000 from any one man. And if they do appropriate any portion of that stock anywhere else, only in that house without the consent of the stockholder, and do not repay fourfold for the stock which they appropriate anywhere else, only in that house they shall be accursed, and shall be moved out of their place, saith the Lord God. For I, the Lord, am God, and cannot be mocked in any of these things. Doctrine and Covenants, section 124. The revelation then went on guilelessly to grant Joseph a suite of rooms in the hotel for himself and his posterity, from generation to generation, forever and ever. Joseph had somehow succeeded in welding two antithetical principles. He had come to identify the goodness of God with the making of money, and had succeeded in making the union palatable to his saints. Embedded in Joseph's character was the commonplace Yankee mixture of piety and avarice. But this seed he developed to a special flowering. The true mystic is preoccupied with things of the spirit, and in so far as he concerns himself with worldly affairs, he denies his calling. But in Joseph's revelations, lessons on the nature of God and guidance for the operation of a boarding house sit side by side, like Hyperion and the satyr, enthroned in equal majesty. The Mormon apostles who went to England had seen America's worst panic and thought they knew something about the poverty attendant upon economic depression. But in England they found, in addition to financial chaos and unemployment, the appalling housing of the urban slums and a fearful burden of taxes weighing on the thin shoulders of the poor. The hated corn laws were still in force, stifling trade and doubling the cost of bread. Thousands of workers were crowded into squat tenements built without water or sewers and almost without windows. Sporadic strikes were suppressed with vicious cruelty, and the reform movement known as Chartism was looked upon as the dread specter of revolution. George A. Smith wrote back to Nauvoo, "I have seen more beggars here in one day than I saw in all my life in America." Times and Seasons, Volume 1, the 15th of November, 1840, page 223. Shocked by what they found, the Mormon elders began to preach the glory of America along with the glory of the gospel. Brigham Young was convinced that emigration was the only solution for Europe's overpopulation, and made this the theme of many of his sermons. Soon the missionaries were publishing in Liverpool a little journal called the Millennial Star, which frequently had the ring of a real estate agency propaganda pamphlet. Living in America is about 1/8 of what it costs in this country. Millions on millions of acres of land lie before them unoccupied, with a soil as rich as Eden, and a surface as smooth, clear and ready for the plow as the park scenery of England. Instead of a lonely swamp or dense forest filled with savages, wild beasts, and serpents, large cities and villages are springing up in their midst, with schools, colleges, and temples, there being abundant room for more than 100 millions of inhabitants. Millennial Star, the 1st of February, 1842. Before long, the apostles were converting Englishmen in thousands. Their success loosed a deluge of anti-Mormon pamphlets. Even the sophisticated London Athenaeum took note of the new sect. Mormonism is making rapid progress, it pointed out on the 3rd of April, 1841, particularly in the manufacturing districts, and it is also spreading in Wales. Furthermore, its converts are not made from the lowest ranks. Those sought and obtained by the Mormonite apostles are mechanics and tradesmen who have saved a little money, who are remarkable for their moral character, but who are exposed to the delusion from having, as Archbishop Sharp expressed it, studied the Bible with an ill-balanced mind. Only London was deaf to the call to Zion. Heber Kimball worked there for weeks before he washed its dust from his heels and consigned it to the devil. "We found the whole city given to covetousness," he wrote home, "and all doors closed against us. We did not hesitate to stand in the midst of the streets, and Jonah-like cry repentance unto the inhabitants, who are ripening in iniquity, and preparing for the wrath of God, and like the ox going to the slaughter, know not the day of their visitation." 200 converts left England for Nauvoo in 1840. In 1841, the number jumped to 2,200, and the following year 2,600. "They had rather be slaves in America than starve in this country," wrote Parley Pratt. "I cannot keep them back." By 1844, there were at least 8,000 more clamoring to leave. See the emigration statistics compiled by James Linforth in Route from Liverpool to Great Salt Lake Valley, 1855, pages 14 to 15, George J. Adams, A Few Plain Facts, etc. Bedford, England, 1841, page 15. Joseph F. Smith, Jr., The Origin of the Reorganized Church, Salt Lake City, 1907, page 8. Few apostles remained in Britain more than a year, but before they left their work in the hands of lesser men, they had organized an emigration system which became so well known for its honesty and efficiency that it was cited in the House of Commons as a model for other companies to follow. The Mormons set up an office, chartered their own ships, organized the emigrants so that there would be ample food and water, and charged less than £4 for the journey all the way to New Orleans. Much of the credit for the success of the emigration system was due Brigham Young, whose business head was one of the soundest in the church. He had been one of the first apostles to return to Nauvoo, and it was from there that he directed the missionary enterprise. And within a month after his return, he had persuaded the prophet to shift all the business affairs of the church from the High Council over to the apostles. Joseph, however, still retained the ultimate authority in financial matters. It was a long time before Young succeeded in straightening out Nauvoo's chaotic finances, for Joseph's investments too often returned nothing. Although many rich converts trusted the prophet with their fortunes, upon his arrival in Nauvoo, Edward Hunter, third bishop of the church, unhesitatingly handed over to Joseph $7,000 in cash and $4,000 in merchandise. Improvement Era, Volume 44, August 1941, page 493. To the United States of America, the 10th of September, $1840, 4,866.38. To Horace R. Hotchkiss and Company, Fairhaven, Con., $50,000. 0 to John Wilkie, Nauvoo, $2,700. To W. M. Backenstoes and Jacob Backenstoes, Carthage, $1,000. To John, name illegible, $1,100. To Truman Blodgett, $100. To William F. Cahoon, Nauvoo, $500. To Edward Partridge's estate, Nauvoo, $10,000. To Amos Davis, Nauvoo, $2,800. Grand total, $73,066. 38. These debts were copied from a schedule setting forth a list of petitioners, creditors, their residence, and the amount due each, which is in the library of the reorganized church. The Kirtland debts have already been listed on page 201. Still, he remained in debt. In the spring of 1841, he catalogued a list of his outstanding liabilities and found them to total over $70,000, in addition to another $33,000 carried over from Kirtland days. It is not surprising, therefore, that he looked with interest upon the bankruptcy law that Congress passed in 1841 to relieve the straits of the debtor class. No one in Washington, apparently, had any foresight as to the fabulous popularity of this bankruptcy law. In the brief period of its operation, 440 millions of liabilities were wiped out for 44 millions of assets. When Congress went back into session, it repealed the law in haste. But in the meantime, the Mormon prophet, together with his brothers Hiram and Samuel and a host of leading Mormon dignitaries, had joined the stampede. See the notice of Joseph's bankruptcy proceedings in the Wasp, Nauvoo, Illinois, May 7, 1842. See also History of the Church, Volume 4, page 594-600, Volume 5, pages 6 to 7, 200. It was an evil day in the summer of 1840, some months after his return from Washington, that Joseph baptized into the church Dr. John Cook Bennett. He had been an instructor in midwifery in an obscure Ohio college, and was now secretary of the Illinois Medical Society and quartermaster general of the Illinois Militia. He was 35, the same age as the prophet, but his short, dapper figure and dark complexion were in striking contrast with Joseph's blond and careless magnificence. Emma distrusted Bennett's easy, vivacious manner and facile tongue from the beginning, whereas Joseph was immediately attracted. Before coming to Nauvoo, Bennett had written the prophet a barrage of letters proclaiming his own special virtues with the kind of extravagant rhetoric that most easily blinded Joseph to a man's true character. The prophet had drawn up a series of charters incorporating the city of Nauvoo, providing for a university, and calling for the organization of a militia body to be called the Nauvoo Legion. The city charter gave the Nauvoo City Council power to make, ordain, establish, and execute all such ordinances not repugnant to the Constitution of the United States or of this state, an ingenious wording which Joseph later interpreted in the widest possible sense. The Nauvoo Legion was to be technically a part of the state militia, but actually an autonomous military body whose commander would be answerable only to the governor. Bennett vowed he could push these charters through the Illinois legislature. The Mormons at the moment were in a strategic position for bargaining for legislative favor. Soured on the Democratic Party by Van Buren's indifference, they had voted the straight Whig ticket in the election of November 1840, except for one candidate. In order to give their votes to a Democrat, James H. Ralston, who had done the prophet some favors, they scratched the name which happened to be last on the Whig list. The spurned candidate was an obscure young politician named Abraham Lincoln. History of the Church, Volume 4, page 248. Despite this demonstration of Whig preference, Joseph Smith made it clear that his people would join neither party, but would hold themselves free to vote according to services rendered. As a result, the legislative session of 1841 saw each party stumbling over the other in its frantic efforts to win the Mormon vote, which by now counted heavily in the balance of Illinois politics. Bennett introduced himself to the leaders of both parties and cozened them equally with promises of Mormon favor. The charters were rushed through both houses and passed by a voice vote without ever being read, except by title. Then it wrote back exultingly to the prophet, "Every power we asked has been granted, every request gratified, every desire fulfilled." Even Lincoln, he said, had the magnanimity to vote for our act and came forward after the final vote to the bar of the House and cordially congratulated me on its passage. Letter from Springfield, the 16th of December, 1840. History of the Church, Volume 4, page 248. See also Thomas Ford, History of Illinois, page 263. The winning of the Nauvoo charters was Joseph's first great political victory, and it made him feel immeasurably obligated to Bennett. It is therefore not surprising that when ugly rumors of the man's debauchery and profligacy caught up with him in Nauvoo, Joseph hastily dismissed them. When Hiram learned on a trip east that Bennett had deserted a wife and 2 children, and had been expelled from the Masonic Lodge for unprincipled conduct, he wrote of it to Joseph, History of the Church, Volume 5, but the prophet filed the letter in his drawer. Less than 1 year after his coming to Nauvoo, Bennett had become assistant president of the church. Rigdon had never been deposed as first counselor, but he had been practically bedridden since his release from jail, and Bennett assumed all his duties. In addition, Bennett became mayor of the city, chancellor of the University of Nauvoo, and brigadier general of the Nauvoo Legion, second in command to Joseph. In a revelation the Lord had pronounced him blessed. "I have seen the work which he hath done, which I accept, if he continue, and will crown him with blessings and great glory." Ebed M, Volume 4, page 341, and Doctrine and Covenants, section 124, verse 17. Bennett was Joseph's most intimate friend and counselor for a year and a half. Although during this period Nauvoo was fast becoming the most notorious city in Illinois, outwardly it was a model of propriety. There was not a saloon in the city, and if a man wanted to drink, he had to buy his whiskey from a shop specially licensed by the mayor and take it home with him. "If you want to retire from the noise of the Bacchanalian song," said the Times and Seasons, "the midnight broils, and the scenes of drunkenness which disgrace so many of our cities and villages, come to Nauvoo. No such proceedings are allowed." Times and Seasons, Volume 2, the 2nd of August, 1841, page 496. For a time the city did have a brothel, which stood but a square away from the temple, using a grocery store as a front. But when urchins scrawled witticisms over its rough boards and an unfriendly editor in Montrose, Iowa, slyly accused the prophet of abetting the lonely wreck of folly, the Nauvoo City Council pronounced it a nuisance over the protests, it was said, of the worldly Johns. Bennett and a deputation of the Legion tipped it backwards over the edge of a gully, where it went crashing to the bottom. Ebed M, Volume 3, the 15th of November, 1841, page 599, and The Wasp, Volume 1, Number 26, the 15th of October, 1842. Nauvoo's self-righteous holiness did not endear her to her sister cities. They resented the pious-speaking city council, which would pass an ordinance threatening vagrants, idle persons, and those who could not give a good account of themselves with a $500 fine and a 6 months jail sentence merely for indulgence in profane or indecent language. Times and Seasons, Volume 3, the 1st of December, 1841, page 622. Did a sect have the right to impose its own standards on the casual visitor, they asked? Or was not this ordinance a device to keep non-Mormons out of the city? What were these saints so anxious to hide? The epithet community of wives came more and more to be applied to the holy city. So prominent an organ as the New York Herald on May 16, 1842, reported the rumor that in Nauvoo, men and women connected in promiscuous intercourse without regard to the holy bonds of matrimony. The lone Presbyterian minister in Hancock County wrote to a fellow pastor on May 3, 1842, I presume Nauvoo is as perfect a sink of debauchery and every species of abomination as ever were, Sodom or Nineveh. Letter from the Reverend W. M. King to Absalom Peters, published in the Illinois State Historical Society Journal, Volume 32, Number 2, June 1839. Stories of thievery, from whatever source, were pinned upon the Mormons by the outlying communities, and it became common gossip that Joseph himself sanctioned milking the Gentiles. The latter rumor, the prophet. Hancock County had always been a hideout for river pirates, and a few of these doubtful citizens joined the Mormons, expecting to find shelter from the law in the church's bosom. Joseph excommunicated as many as he could catch and denounced the use of his name as a shield for their infamy. Few thoughtful persons believed that Nauvoo was either a den of debauchery or a hideout for Mississippi outlaws. James Gordon Bennett, the urbane editor of the New York Herald, though not shy about printing salacious insinuations concerning the city, was always careful to print Mormon denials alongside, and in his editorials usually sided with the Mormon point of view. This Bennett took a peculiar interest in Joseph Smith and gave him extraordinarily good publicity, said one editorial on the 19th of January, 1842. Here is a new prophet, starting into existence in the green valleys and lovely little hills of the town of Manchester in Ontario County, New York. Leaving New York, as Moses left Egypt, wandering over the wild prairies of the West as the great Jewish lawgiver wandered over the wilderness of Zion, and ultimately establishing a holy city and a new religious empire on the Mississippi that numbers 0 persons in the city, and 30 beyond its limits, with a splendid temple for public worship and a military organization of 15 pretty well disciplined troops. This presents a germ of religious civilization. Novel, affecting, inviting, wonderful, and extraordinary. All the priests and philosophers of the day may take a lesson from Joe Smith, who seems to have hit the nail exactly on the head by uniting faith and practice, fancy and fact, religion and philosophy, heaven and earth, so as to form the germ of a new religious civilization. Bound together in love and temperance, in industry and energy, that may revolutionize the whole earth one of these days. Joe Smith is evidently no fool. He knows what he is about. Go ahead, old boy. Few visitors to Nauvoo had either the New York editor's perception or his imagination, or had any idea of the potentialities of the Mormon movement. But many of them were troubled by the unmistakable military atmosphere that pervaded the city. Every village in the state had its militia group, which paraded on muster days in a carelessly impromptu fashion and made a beeline for the tavern when the dusty marching was over. The Nauvoo Legion, however, looked upon itself as the army of the Lord, drilled regularly and strenuously and boasted smartly uniformed officers. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 45 was compelled to join, and heavy fines were imposed for failure to appear at parade. By January 1842, the Legion had a complement of 2,000 men. John Cook Bennett used his position as Quartermaster General of the Illinois Militia to secure 3 pieces of cannon and about 250 stand of small arms, which alarmed Gentile rumor increased to 30 pieces of cannon and some 5,000 or 6,000 muskets. Bennett took care to organize the Legion as a corps of riflemen, whereas the older units in the state were armed chiefly with swords and muskets. See Thomas Ford, History of Illinois, page 267, and Times and Seasons, volume 2, page 419. Fancying himself a peerless strategist, he was never so pleased as when he was. Joseph requested, and received, from Governor Carlin the commission of lieutenant general, and thereafter frequently jested about his outranking every military officer in the United States. He came to prefer the title general even to president, and used it in much of his correspondence. His uniform was smartly designed. A blue coat with a plentiful supply of gold braid, buff trousers, high military boots, and a handsome chapeau topped with ostrich feathers. On his hip he carried a sword and 2 big horse pistols. Delighting in the pomp and splendor of parades, he called out the Legion on every possible occasion, marching at the head on his magnificent black stallion, Charlie. The military spirit infected all the boys in Nauvoo, and Joseph, with his eye ever on the future, soon had them organized into a military corps of their own. Between 400 and 600 paraded and drilled with as much zest as their fathers. Joseph's eldest son, who was a member of the boys' army, took part on the memorable occasion when they decided to invade Nauvoo. The Legion, prepared to give the boys a good scare, lined up to meet them. The men did not know that the youthful corps had raided their mothers' kitchens for every available pot and pan in the city, and when the boys charged out of the woods, beating on the kettles and shrieking, the Legion horses went into a panic and refused to charge. Finally, the prophet, who was watching the scene mounted on the imperturbable Charlie, spurred the big stallion forward, squarely into the oncoming boys. They scattered nimbly, the invasion repelled, and the prophet became the hero of the day. Memoirs of President Joseph Smith, Saints Herald, the 1st of January, 1935, page 16. The Legion was no mere toy to gratify Joseph's love of pageantry. It was first of all a bulwark against Missouri, for legally the prophet was still a fugitive from justice and could expect writs to be served on him without warning. As time wore on and rumors of the coming of Missouri sheriffs trickled persistently into Nauvoo, Joseph came to fear extradition more than anything else in the world. In mid-September 1840 the first sheriff materialized, bearing a writ for Joseph from Governor Reynolds of Missouri, reinforced by a demand from the Illinois governor, Thomas Carlin. When Joseph learned of the sheriff's approach, he immediately went into hiding. The sheriff returned the writ to Carlin and made no further effort to catch his prey. Thereafter, Joseph appointed a bodyguard of 12 men, his toughest fighters and most devoted friends. Among them were Porter Rockwell, William Hickman, Hosea Stout, Jonathan Holmes, and John D. Lee. The bodyguard, dressed in white uniforms, made a pretty sight marching and wheeling about the uniformed figure of their chief in Legion parades. Apparently, this group was the sole remnant of the Danite band, though not all of the bodyguard had been Danites in Missouri. Lee, who called himself the 7th Danite, was appointed to guard Joseph's home. "It was my duty to do as I was ordered," he wrote in his autobiography, "and not ask questions." 8 months after the coming of the first sheriff from Missouri, a second one appeared, supported by a posse. They intercepted Joseph when he was returning unescorted to Nauvoo after a visit with Governor Carlin, who apparently knew and approved the plan in advance. The seizure was a virtual kidnapping. Not until he was carried into Quincy, the last town between him and a Missouri dungeon, was he able to obtain a writ of habeas corpus. This respite was enough to save him. Stephen A.D. Outglass, judge of the Illinois Supreme Court, who happened to be in Quincy, offered to test the validity of the Missouri writ in nearby Monmouth. Then, 3 prominent Whig, since he was nominal head of the Illinois Democratic Party, rushed to Monmouth for the privilege of defending the prophet. With both political parties behind him, Joseph had little to fear. Douglas freed him on a technicality, decreeing that the writ was dead since it had been returned to the governor in September 1840. He refused to judge the case on its merits, there being no precedent to guide him on the issue of extradition, which involved, he said, great and important considerations relative to the future conduct of the different states. Joseph was free, but he was still a fugitive and could never be certain that the whole process would not one day be repeated, with the judge deciding against him. To meet this day, he planned to have an army in reserve. John C. Bennett, however, looked upon the Legion with a much more aggressive imagination. In Times and Seasons, he published a series of articles under the pseudonym Joab, General in Israel, which made it clear that the Mormon Church was now a power capable of avenging the wrongs inflicted upon it by the sword if need be. At first, Bennett's column was largely allegory and bombast, but it evolved into a hard-knuckled challenge to Missouri for restitution of Mormon property. The blood of murdered Mormons cries aloud for help, and the restoration of the inheritances of the saints. And God has heard the cry. And if the moral battle must be fought, and the victory won, he who answers by fire will cause sword and flame to do their office, and again make the Constitution and laws paramount to every other consideration. And I swear by the Lord God of Israel that the sword shall not depart from my thigh, nor the buckler from my arm, until the trust is consummated, and the hydra-headed fiery dragon slain. Times and Seasons, Volume 3, the 15th of March, 1842, page 724. Bennett's columns enraged the Gentiles and gave substance to the spreading idea that the Mormons intended to recapture their lost property by the sword. By accident or design, a United States artillery officer witnessed a full-dress parade of the Legion in Nauvoo on May 7, 1842. To the New York Herald, which published his article on the 17th of June, he wrote excitedly, "What does all this mean? Why this exact discipline of the Mormon corps? Do they intend to conquer Missouri, Illinois, Mexico? It is true, they are a part of the militia of the state of Illinois by the character of their legion, but then there are no troops in the states like them in point of enthusiasm and warlike aspect, yea, warlike character. Before many years this legion will be 20 and perhaps 50,000 strong, and still augmenting, but fearful host, filled with religious enthusiasm, and led on by ambitious and talented officers. What may not be affected by them? Perhaps the subversion of the Constitution of the United States, and if this should be considered too great a task, foreign conquest will certainly follow. Mexico will fall into their hands even if Texas should first take it. I have seen Bennett's plans for the fortification of Nauvoo, which are equal to any of Vauban's. The time will come when this gathering host of religious fanatics will make this country shake to its center. A Western Empire is certain." Chapter 19. Mysteries of the Kingdom. A man's memory is bound to be a distortion of his past in accordance with his present interests, and the most faithful autobiography is likely to mirror less what a man was than what he has become. Joseph Smith always dictated his journal with an intense consciousness of his audience, and in the 1840s, when he began in earnest to write the official history of his church for the edification of posterity, he reconstructed his past as only a celebrated prophet of the 19th century would have lived it. It was all of one color, a succession of miracles and revelations, and in no sense an evolution. It became, in fact, an almost impenetrable hiding place, where he concealed himself behind a perpetual flow of words. He began the story of his life with the fabulous vision of the Father and the Son, which in 1842, when the account was first published, dated back 22 years. It was first printed in Times and Seasons, Volume 3, the 1st of March, 1842, though a short account by Orson Pratt was published in Remarkable Visions in 1840. Whether this was an elaboration upon a vivid childhood dream or a fantasy woven out of half-remembered miracle tales does not matter. Dream images came easily to him, and with such intense color and luxuriant detail that the matter of accuracy or chronology was of no importance. When he described the vision in a letter to John Wentworth, editor of the Chicago Democrat, who had requested the story of his life, it was a thing of substance in his memory. As his fame increased, Joseph became more and more preoccupied with the record of his life. Everything in his past was interpreted to enhance the glory of the present. "The history must continue and not be disturbed," he wrote, "as there are but few subjects that I have felt a greater anxiety about." History of the Church, Volume 6, page 60. The Book of Mormon must have been a source of secret worry. Later editions had corrected many of the errors in grammar and spelling, but the book was still being challenged by critical readers. As editor of Times and Seasons, Joseph published extracts from Ethan Smith, Josiah Priest, and Alexander von Humboldt, and urged his people to read Stevens's Incidents of Travel in Central America, all of which seem to corroborate the Book of Mormon story. See Times and Seasons, the 15th of June, the 15th of July, and the 15th of August, 1842. All of the Golden Plate witnesses, save his two brothers, Samuel and Hiram, had either died or left the church. Oliver Cowdery had carried off one copy of the manuscript when he apostatized, leaving the other as the only tangible reminder of the book's origin. This manuscript Joseph decided to bury in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, along with a few other relics, and interrupted the ceremony of laying the stone in order to bring the manuscript from his home. Ebenezer Robinson was shocked to hear him say, as he flipped through the pages to make sure it was complete, "I have had trouble enough with this thing." The Return, Volume 2, August 1890, page 315. Joseph never apologized for the Book of Mormon. He called it bluntly the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion. There is no doubt, however, that he could be stung by barbs aimed at it. Eber D. Howe had once pointed out that the name Mormon came from a Greek word meaning monster, and in modern usage referred to a particularly hideous baboon. Throughout the years, this bit of philological research had been repeated over and again by anti-Mormon writers, until finally Joseph countered it with a little research and imagination of his own. It has been stated that this word was derived from the Greek word mormo. This is not the case. There was no Greek or Latin upon the plates from which I, through the grace of God, translated the Book of Mormon. We say from the Saxon good, the Dane God, the Goth Goda, the German Gut, the Dutch Good, the Latin bonus, the Greek kalos, the Hebrew tob, and the Egyptian mon. Hence, with the addition of more, or the contraction more, we have the word Mormon, which means literally more good. Times and Seasons, Volume 4, May 15, 1843, page 194. The bulk of this essay was omitted from the History of the Church. See Volume 5, page 400. The careful review of his own astonishing career entailed in writing his history filled Joseph with a sense of wonder. Although it seldom crept into the narrative, he could not repress it in his sermons and letters. "As for the perils which I am called to pass through," he said, "they seem but a small thing to me, as the envy and wrath of man have been my common lot all the days of my life. And for what cause it seems mysterious, unless I was ordained from before the foundation of the world for some good end or bad. But, nevertheless, deep water is what I am wont to swim in. It has all become second nature to me." Letter to the Saints, written the 1st of September, 1842. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 143. During the Nauvoo years, filled though they were with lawsuits, arrests, and intrigues among his own people, Joseph found time not only to write the history of his church, but also to bring Mormon theology to its full flowering. His teachings were now rarely presented as revelations. They were either introduced in sermons or imparted secretly. Only 2 revelations of significance appeared in the 4 Nauvoo years, yet there was no more fruitful period in Joseph's thinking. Since the great amorphous mass of revelations flung together in the Doctrine and Covenants was unwieldy as a guide for his people, he spent considerable time working out a simplified and lucid creed. This took the form of 13 Articles of Faith, which became the functional basis of Mormon doctrine. We believe in God the Eternal Father, and in His Son Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost. We believe that men will be punished for their own sins, and not for Adam's transgression. We believe that through the atonement of Christ all mankind may be saved by obedience to the laws and ordinances of the gospel. We believe that the first principles and ordinances of the gospel are 1. Faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, 2. Repentance, 3. Baptism by immersion for the remission of sins, 4. Laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost. We believe that a man must be called of God by prophecy and by the laying on of hands by those who are in authority to preach the gospel and administer in the ordinances thereof. We believe in the same organization that existed in the primitive church, namely apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists, etc. We believe in the gift of tongues, prophecy, revelation, visions, healing, interpretation of tongues, etc. We believe the Bible to be the Word of God, as far as it is translated correctly. We also believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God. We believe all that God has revealed, all that He does now reveal, and we believe that He will yet reveal many great and important things pertaining to the kingdom of God. We believe in the literal gathering of Israel, and in the restoration of the 10 tribes, that Zion will be built upon this, the American continent, that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory. We claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege, let them worship how, where, or what they may. We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. We believe in being honest, true, chaste, benevolent, virtuous, and in doing good to all men. Indeed, we may say that we follow the admonition of Paul. We believe all things, we hope all things, we have endured many things, and hope to be able to endure all things. If there is anything virtuous, lovely, or of good report, or praiseworthy, we seek after these things. Except for the reference to the Book of Mormon and the doctrine of continuous revelation, there was very little in this creed to which a Bible-reading Christian could object, but simply because there was so little in it that was at all new. Actually, it was only the first rung in the ladder of Mormon theology. It ignored the Order of Enoch, which had figured so prominently in the Church's early history, because Joseph was done with it forever. Joseph wrote in his journal on the 24th of September, 1843, I preached on the stand about 1 hour on the 2nd chapter of Acts, designing to show the folly of common stock. In Nauvoo, everyone is steward over his own. History of the Church, Volume 6, page 37. It did not mention the doctrine of plurality of gods, which was one of the pillars of the new philosophy. And it did not even hint at the new and rapidly developing temple ritual. In the spring of 1842, the simple rites of washing and anointing that had been performed in the Kirtland Temple were transformed into a complicated and mysterious ceremonial, which for a time was kept as secret as polygamy. In the beginning, only men were permitted initiation, but by the spring of 1844, women were granted the same privilege. Heber C. Kimball, in his journal, pages 14 to 15, noted that his wife, Violate, had been washed, anointed, and sealed by Emma Smith. This is quoted by his daughter, Helen Mar Whitney, in Plural Marriage as Taught by the Prophet Joseph, Salt Lake City, 1882. The succession of apostates who exposed the temple mysteries usually hinted of a great sexual orgy. Actually, there was nothing gross or disgusting in the ceremony. Each initiate was washed and anointed by a member of his own sex, and then dressed in a special undergarment covered with a modest flowing robe. The purification ritual was as follows. Brother, having authority, I wash you that you may be clean from the blood and sins of this generation. I wash your head, that your brain may work clearly and be quick of discernment. Your eyes, that you may see clearly and discern the things of God. Your ears, that they may hear the word of the Lord. Your mouth and lips, that they speak no guile. Your arms, that they may be strong to wield the sword in defense of truth and virtue. Your breast and vitals, that their functions may be strengthened. Your loins and reins, that you may be fruitful in the propagating of a goodly seed. Your legs and feet, that you may run and not be weary, walk and not faint. Temple Mormonism, its evolution, ritual, and meaning, New York, 1931, pages 14-15. For the earliest description of the endowment ceremonies, see I. M. Van Dusen, The Sublime and Ridiculous Blended, New York, 1848. The close affinity of religious and phallic rites is a commonplace in social history, and Mormon ritual doubtless had its roots in the same unconscious drives that led the prophet into polygamy. The endowment ceremony was essentially fertility worship. but its basic nature was so camouflaged that only the skeptical felt a sense of outrage. A good deal of the ceremony performed after the rituals of washing and anointing was borrowed from the Freemasons. From his earliest youth in Palmyra, Joseph had known the old Masonic legend, and Masonry dated back to the time of Solomon's Temple. The Palmyra Register, on the 10th of January, 1821, quoted the Masonic Register as follows. Solomon was endowed with wisdom from on high to designate the plan. He called the craft together, and the temple of our God was begun and finished solely by Masonic hands. Actually, Masonry dates from about the 13th century. It originated in Britain as a trade guild, though it incorporated some symbols that date back to various mystery cults in antiquity. Although he had peppered the Book of Mormon with anti-Masonic strictures stemming from the Morgan hysteria, he had long since lost his hostility to the craft. Masonry was now as respectable as before 1827, and when Judge James Adams, Deputy Grand Master of the Illinois Masonic Order, urged him to set up a lodge in Nauvoo, he complied at once. The lodge was formally installed on the 15th of March, 1842, with headquarters in the big room over Joseph's store. John C. Bennett was secretary, see The Wasp, the 30th of April, 1842, and History of the Church, Volume 4, pages 550-2. Joseph became a first-degree Mason on the night of the installation, and the next night rose to the sublime degree. His interest in Masonry became so infectious that many Mormon elders hastened to follow his lead, and within 6 months the lodge had 286 candidates. This accretion left the non-Mormon lodges thunderstruck, for in 1842 the total membership in all of Illinois was. They saw in this growth not only a degeneration of the theory of selective membership, but also a threat to control the Grand Lodge in Springfield. John C. Reynolds, History of the M.W. Grand Lodge of Illinois, Ancient Free and Accepted Masons, Springfield, 1869, page 166. There is no doubt that Joseph's primary interest in Masonry lay in its ritual. Like Solomon, he was a temple builder. Whatever had come down through the ages that was of value he meant to incorporate into his church. 6 weeks after the installation of the lodge, he called 7 of his leading men, Masonic Grand Master James Adams among them, and in this council, he said, was instituted the ancient order of things for the first time in these last days. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 2. This order was an elaborate ritual designed for performance in the Nauvoo temple. The ceremony, which for a time was kept completely secret, was reserved for the faithful, who believed it to be the summation of all spiritual blessing. The men were stripped, washed, anointed, and then, as in the Masonic ceremony, dressed in a special garment, which was held together with strings or bone buttons, metal being forbidden. According to John C. Bennett, this garment at first was a kind of shirt, which was worn only during the ceremony and then hidden away as a kind of security against destroying angels. But it was shortly changed into an unlovely and utilitarian long suit of underwear, which the novice was instructed to wear always as a protection against evil. The Masonic square and compass were cut into the garment on the breast, and a slash was made across the knee. In the beginning, the cut across the knee was apparently deep enough to penetrate the flesh and leave a scar. There was also a slash in the garment across the abdomen, symbolic of the disemboweling that would be the fate of anyone who revealed the sacred secrets. After swearing to an oath of secrecy, the initiate was dressed in white robes and permitted to witness a long allegorical drama depicting the creation of the earth and the fall of Adam. Joseph, it is said, took the role of God, Hiram Smith that of Christ, and Bishop George Miller that of the Holy Ghost. The drama followed the language of Genesis, with God pretending to create Eve from the sleeping Adam, with Eve plucking raisins from a tiny tree, symbolizing the tree of knowledge, and with W.W. Phelps as the devil crawling about serpent-like on his stomach. According to John C. Bennett, History of the Saints, Boston, 1842, page 277. Succeeding years saw minor changes in this drama, but it is clear that the present Mormon ritual is essentially the same. The second anointing, reserved for leading church officials, has never been described in print. After being expelled from the Garden of Eden, the actors representing Adam and Eve donned tiny white aprons, which were exactly like the Masonic aprons except that they were painted with green fig leaves. Then followed instruction in certain grips. Each man was given a secret name by which he was to be known in the kingdom of heaven. It may seem surprising that Joseph should have incorporated so much masonry into the endowment ceremony in the very weeks when all his leading men were being inducted into the Masonic Lodge. They would have been blind indeed not to see the parallelism between the costuming, grips, passwords, keys, and oaths. Joseph made free use of other Masonic symbols, the beehive, the all-seeing eye, the two clasped hands, and the point within the circle. The miracle play performed in the Mormon ceremony differed only in subject matter from the Masonic drama of Hiram Abiff, and both used many of the same sonorous phrases from the Old Testament. Joseph taught his men simply that the Masonic ritual was a corruption of the ancient ritual of Solomon, and that his own was a restoration of the true Hebraic endowment. The most comprehensive analysis of the relation between Masonry and the Mormon temple ritual has been made by S. H. Goodwin. See his Mormonism and Masonry, Salt Lake City, 7th printing, 1938, and Additional Studies in Mormonism and Masonry, Salt Lake City, 1932. Wilford Woodruff once frankly admitted that some temple ordinances were first performed in the Masonic temple in Nauvoo. Temple Lot Case, page 299. The elaboration of the temple endowment transformed the Mormon Church into a mystery cult. The secrecy, pageantry, and veiled phallicism appealed to very basic human instincts, and the fact that they seemed to be rooted in Old Testament tradition gave them an authenticity demanded by this Bible-reading people. The temple mysteries were closely bound up with Joseph's new theories about the nature of heaven and hell. After death, he said, all souls went to the world of spirits, similar to the purgatory of Catholic theology, where they remained in a not unpleasant imprisonment until the judgment day. Only those who had joined the true church could clamber immediately up the road to godhood. Those who had missed the chance to hear the gospel on earth could be freed from the world of spirits by the good offices of any Mormon. To liberate a dead relative or friend, one simply acted as proxy in the ordinances of baptism and sealing. In this manner, not only relatives, but also all the heroic figures of the past could be released from spiritual bondage, and every Mormon was granted the opportunity of going through the oddly exciting temple ritual, not once but hundreds of times. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians had made an ambiguous reference to baptism for the dead, and at least one German sect had practiced this ritual in Pennsylvania. Joseph taught it openly. History of the Church, Volume 4, pages 568-9. Times and Seasons, the 15th of April, 1842. At first the Mormons were baptized in the Mississippi, and later in an elaborate font standing upon the backs of 12 white wooden oxen in the temple basement. It is doubtful whether Joseph sensed the truly staggering implications of his endowment system. Upon his church now rested the burden of freeing the billions of spirits who had never heard the law of the Lord. Nauvoo had become the center not only of the world, but also of the universe. But Joseph laid no great emphasis on the temple ordinances. The costuming, pageantry, and general abracadabra had attracted him to the Masonic ritual in the first place, just as the theatricalism of the conjurer's art had lured him to the money-digging of his youth. And though he gave an ingenious theological significance to his own adaptation and development of the Masonic drama, it was always secondary to the pomp and spectacle. Leave the lodge room to transact the sale of a city lot. Chapter 20. In the Quiver of the Almighty. It would have taken a more phlegmatic person than Joseph to withstand the barrage of favorable newspaper publicity that he received in the spring of 1842. The New York Herald, New York Tatler, and Boston Bee all wrote lavish encomiums, spiced with enough mockery to please the Gentile public. There is some good in every sect of religion, wrote Bennett of the Herald in a whimsical mood, and we give fair support to all, from the Pope of Rome to Joe Smith. All we ask in return for our reports is a good cool seat, bench, or location when the end of the world comes and the everlasting bonfire begins. New York Herald, the 7th of November, 1842. Joseph ignored the mockery and republished Bennett's columns, carefully expurgated in Times and Seasons. He was not one to quibble over details when he could reprint a paragraph like the following. This Joe Smith is undoubtedly one of the greatest characters of the age. He indicates as much talent, originality, and moral courage as Mahomet, Odin, or any of the great spirits that have hitherto produced the revolutions of past ages. While modern philosophy, which believes in nothing but what you can touch, is overspreading the Atlantic states, Joe Smith is creating a spiritual system, combined also with morals and industry, that may change the destiny of the race. Ividum, the 3rd of April, 1842, the prophet repaid James Gordon Bennett with an honorary LL.D. from the University of Nauvoo, with a brigadier generalship in the Nauvoo Legion, and with the keys to the city. This was no mere gracious gesture, acknowledging an unsolicited favor. It was a bid for Bennett's permanent support. For Joseph took the acclaim seriously. Here was the first editor of national prominence to describe the personage Joseph believed himself to be. 13 years' adoration from his people had crystallized his abiding sense of destiny. Assault, apostasy, bankruptcy, and imprisonment he had weathered imperturbably, for each trouble had been transformed into a symbol of his special calling. Disaster had been a springboard from which he leaped to new successes. It was now easy for him to believe the simplest and most gratifying explanation for his success, that God had willed it. Without that belief, he could not have spoken so exuberantly in his name. Joseph accepted the newspaper effusions exultantly. They helped sharpen his self-consciousness, giving him a perspective on his position in the American scene that he had long sensed but never clearly formulated. He began to speculate on the role of the prophet in human society, and evolved a theory of government suited to the empire he proposed to build. The great and wise of ancient days have failed in all their attempts to promote eternal power, peace, and happiness, he wrote. Their nations have crumbled to pieces, their thrones have been cast down in their turn, and their cities and their mightiest works of art have been annihilated, or their dilapidated towers of time-worn monuments have left us but feeble traces of their former magnificence and ancient grandeur. They proclaim as with a voice of thunder those imperishable truths, that man's strength is weakness, his wisdom is folly, his glory is his shame. Monarchical, aristocratical, and republican governments of their various kinds and grades have in their turn been raised to dignity and prostrated in the dust. History records their puerile plans, their short-lived glory, their feeble intellect, and their ignoble deeds. Have we increased in knowledge and intelligence? Where is there a man that can step forth and alter the destiny of nations and promote the happiness of the world? The answer, he said, was clear to every man who hungered after righteousness. The ideal government was a theocracy, a government by a prophet specially chosen to administer the laws of God. This government, he wrote, is the only thing that can bring about the restitution of all things spoken of by all the holy prophets. The world has had a fair trial for 6,000 years. Lord will try the 7,000 himself. History of the Church, Volume 5, pages 61 to 6. This was no mere... It is clear that Joseph was coming to look upon himself as the key figure in the setting up of a great religious kingdom which would free the earth from oppression, tyranny, and bloodshed. How much the glowing newspaper accounts contributed to this thinking cannot easily be measured. But there is no doubt that they betrayed Joseph into rashness. The fact that the Eastern editors talked openly of a Mormon empire obscured his view of the prodigious obstacles to any such enterprise. Actually, he was far less secure than he knew, and his public displays of power did more to undermine than to sustain him. The Legion paraded too openly and too often for the good of the saints. If he would take friendly advice, the editor of the Sangamo Journal in Springfield wrote curtly on the 21st of January, 1842, we would say, let some Joshua, the son of Nun, lead the armies, and let him stick to interpretation and prophecy. for we do assure him upon an honest belief that his situation in Illinois is far more dangerous than ever it was in Missouri if he undertakes to take Mahomet's part. The Legion was not the only irritation. Joseph now began playing politics in earnest. His people had voted the Whig ticket in 1840 and again in 1841, but he had made it clear from the beginning that this vote could be swung on a moment's notice. When the Democrats selected as candidates for governor and lieutenant governor in the election of 1842 Adam W. Snyder and John Moore, both of whom had been active in getting the Mormon charters through the legislature, the prophet decided to shift the Mormon vote back to the Democratic Party. He bared this intention with a proclamation that set both parties back on their heels. To my friends in Illinois, the gubernatorial convention of the state of Illinois have nominated Colonel Adam W. Snyder for governor and Colonel John Moore for lieutenant governor of the state of Illinois. Election to take place in August next. General Bennett informs us that no men were more efficient in assisting him to procure our great chartered privileges than were Colonel Snyder and Colonel Moore. They are sterling men and friends of equal rights, opposed to the oppressor's grasp and the tyrant's rod. With such men at the head of our state, government will have nothing to fear. In the next canvass we shall be influenced by no party consideration. We care not a fig for Whig or Democrat. They are both alike to us, but we shall go for our friends, our tried friends, and the cause of human liberty, which is the cause of God. We are aware that divide and conquer is the watchword with many, but with us it cannot be done. We love liberty too well. We have suffered too much to be easily duped. We have no cat's paws amongst us. Douglas is a master spirit, and his friends are our friends. Snyder and Moore are his friends, they are ours. We will never be justly charged with the sin of ingratitude. They have served us, and we will serve them. Joseph Smith, Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, Times and Seasons, the 1st of January, 1842. The Democrats, although happy to get the Mormon vote, were frankly embarrassed by this proclamation. This open sellout so early in the campaign simply handed the Whigs a weapon. They were quick to use it. The Alton Telegraph said on the 4th of June, this issuing a proclamation on the part of Joe Smith as Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, commanding his followers to vote for this. Joseph Duncan, the Whig candidate for governor, made repeal of the Mormon charters a basic plank in his platform and took the stump against the foreigners who were pouring into Nauvoo. The Sangamo Journal, chief organ of the Whig party, noting the publicity accorded Joseph in the columns of the New York Herald, republished appropriate sections with cryptic warnings. One of James Gordon Bennett's editorials the Whigs found particularly humiliating. May not this wonderful Mormon movement be the signal for a new religious revolution? Is not Joe Smith its master spirit and General Bennett its military spirit? In Illinois, they have already shown how to acquire power and influence by holding the balance of power between both great parties. They can already dictate to the state of Illinois, and if they pursue the same policy in other states, will they not soon dictate to Congress and decide the presidency? New York Herald, the 17th of June, 1842, reprinted in the Sangamo Journal the 8th of July, 1842. Nowhere did the fires of political resentment burn more furiously than in Warsaw, biggest non-Mormon town in Hancock County. Normally democratic, the citizens here were not content with a switch to the Whigs, but endeavored to start an anti-Mormon party, which would draw its strength from the Democrats as well. The editors of the Warsaw paper, Thomas Sharp and Thomas Gregg, carried on a gusty feud with William Smith, who edited the new secular newspaper in Nauvoo called The Wasp. William set the pace in the first number of The Wasp by calling Thomas Sharp a contemptible demagogue and a complete jackass of an editor, to which Sharp replied in choice frontier diction, "We have received the first number of a new 6x9, recently started at Nauvoo, glyped The Wasp." Of the varmint itself we have nothing to say, further than that the title is a perfect misnomer. If it had been called Polecat, its name would then have corresponded perfectly with the character of its contents. It is needless to inform our readers that we don't fight with such animals, nature having given them a decided advantage. This article William reprinted in The Wasp with a squib beneath. Well done, Tom, ASS. The Wasp, the 16th of April 23, 1842. Joseph had little of William's crudeness, but both men had a certain earthiness and rough vigor that none of the other brothers seems to have possessed. Josiah Butterfield came to my house, Joseph wrote in his journal one day, and insulted me so outrageously that I kicked him out of the house, across the yard, and into the street. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 316. Here was a prophet who could hold his own with any man on the frontier. Tough, hard-headed leaders like Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, who abominated sanctimonious humbug, never found Joseph guilty of it. Much of the asceticism of the Kirtland era disappeared in Nauvoo. There were many days when the prophet gave himself over completely to the pleasures of the average man, attending the tent theaters that came to the city, frequenting band concerts and lectures on phrenology. Only mesmerists and Mangifans were denied an audience in Nauvoo, and giving cotillion parties in his big new hotel home, the Nauvoo Mansion. Although Joseph controlled the dispensing of liquor and preached against grog shops, he nevertheless permitted the construction of a brewery and allowed it to advertise its beer and ale in the Nauvoo neighbor. The ardent temperance crusaders in the city must have been discouraged by the prophet's unwillingness to cooperate with them. Quote, "It was reported to me," he wrote in his journal one day, "that some of the brethren had been drinking whiskey that day in violation of the word of wisdom. I called the brethren in and investigated the case, and was satisfied that no evil had been done, and gave them a couple of dollars with directions to replenish the bottle to stimulate them in the fatigues of their sleepless journey." As printed in the Millennial Star, Volume 21, page 283. The words I have italicized were omitted when this passage was reprinted in the History of the Church, Volume 5, page 450. When Janetta Richards presented him with a bottle of wine made by her mother in England, he drank it with relish and noted the incident in his journal without apology. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 380. For every convert who was shocked by such indulgence, there were a score who were further endeared to the prophet by it. His good-humored tolerance of human frailty lost him no strong men. An anecdote in the unpublished diary of Oliver Huntington drolly reflects Joseph's attitude toward temperance. Robert Thompson was a faithful, just clerk for Joseph Smith the prophet in Nauvoo, he wrote, and had been in his office steady near or quite 2 years. Joseph said to Brother Thompson one day, "Robert, I want you to go and get on a bust. Go and get drunk and have a good spree. If you don't, you will die." Robert did not do it, Huntington concluded soberly. He was a very pious, exemplary man, and never guilty of such an impropriety as he thought that to be. In less than 2 weeks he was dead and buried. See Volume 3, page 166 of the typewritten transcript in the Utah State Historical Society Library. Joseph was friendly and hospitable to the hundreds of tourists who were attracted to Nauvoo. Steamboats plying up and down the river stopped regularly to discharge visitors, who were ceremoniously conducted on a tour of the city, including visits to see the mummies, the baptismal font, and the temple, which was fast becoming an imposing monument. The prophet had few illusions about the tourists who wanted a personal interview. When one preacher admitted frankly, "I have no particular business, but I have taken the liberty to call on you," Joseph replied with wry humor, "A good many call on me that way, to satisfy their curiosity, and go away and say, 'Well, I've seen Joe Smith.' Some of them say he is a pretty good-looking smart fellow. He looks as though he knew something, as if he was not the fool and knave he has been called. But others go away and say, 'Well, I've seen Joe Smith. He is a great blubber-mouthed fellow, a knave, a drunkard, a mean, ignorant fellow.'" A Visit to Nauvoo, Universalist Union, the 27th of April, May 4, 1844. One visitor, Henry Caswall, an Episcopalian preacher from a St. Louis college, armed himself with an ancient manuscript psalter written in Greek, and, pretending to be ignorant of its contents, offered it to Joseph for his scrutiny. Under the prophet's questioning, he finally admitted that he believed the language to be Greek, but this Joseph contradicted. Caswall, exaggerating the imperfections of Joseph's grammar, later related the story as follows. "No, it ain't Greek at all," Joseph said, "except perhaps a few words. What ain't Greek is Egyptian, and what ain't Egyptian is Greek. This book is very valuable. It is a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Pointing to the capital letters at the commencement of each verse, he went on, Them figures is Egyptian hieroglyphics, written in reformed Egyptian. Them characters is like the letters that was engraved on the golden plates. When the prophet left the room, Caswall turned triumphantly to the men present and exposed the trick. They appeared confounded for a while, he wrote, but at length the Mormon doctor said, Sometimes Mr. Smith speaks as a prophet, and sometimes as a mere man. If he gave a wrong opinion respecting the book, he spoke as a mere man. The City of the Mormons, or 3 Days at Nauvoo, London, 1840. This defense Joseph would readily have subscribed to himself. Weary of the restrictions imposed by the dignity of his office, annoyed by tales of converts who apostatized when they saw him playing with his children or wrestling with his friends, Joseph often said impatiently, A prophet is a prophet only when he is acting as such. History of the Church, Volume 5, page 265. Perhaps the most deliberate hoax ever played on Joseph Smith was contrived by 3 men in the nearby town of Kinderhook. One of them, Bridge Whitten, cut 6 copper sheets into the shape of a bell, and the other 2, Robert Wiley and Wilbur Fugate, covered them with fanciful writing by a simple etching process. They smeared acid over the plates to corrode them, bound them together with a piece of rusted hoop iron, and carefully buried them along with some Indian bones in an Indian mound nearby that had been an object of much curiosity and desultory digging. Wiley spread the story that he had dreamed of buried treasure 3 nights in succession, and invited assistance in hunting for it. 2 Mormons were present when the plates were found. Although they had suspected a hoax, the sight of the corroded plates banished their mistrust. Shouting for joy, they begged to take them to the prophet for deciphering. But before giving them up, Wiley was careful to clean them with sulfuric acid so that the hieroglyphics could easily be read. The whole of Nauvoo soon buzzed with the discovery. The Times and Seasons published full reproductions as further proof of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, and the printing office sold facsimiles at $1 a dozen. Joseph stated in his journal that he translated a portion and discovered it to be a history of the person whose bones lay in the mound. If the Kinderhook conspirators expected to see another Book of Abraham result from their deception, they were disappointed. Perhaps Joseph had been made cautious by the Greek Psalter trick, which Caswall had described in a nasty anti-Mormon tract. Perhaps he had noted in the New York Herald, which he read regularly, that the Egyptian language had finally been deciphered in a grammar published. New York Herald, the 28th of December, 1842. At any rate, he never published the partial translation, and apparently did not even venture to suggest that the language was reformed Egyptian. The plates were sold to a St. Louis museum, and Fugate did not publicly admit the fraud until 36 years afterward. See the letter from Wilbur Fugate to James T. Cobb, dated Mound Station, Illinois, the 30th of June, 1879, published in W. Weil, Mormon Portraits, page 207, and later in W. A. Lynn, The Story of the Mormons, page 87. See also History of the Church, Volume 5, page 372, Times and Seasons, Volume 4, May 1, 1843, pages 185-7, Nauvoo Neighbor, the 7th of February, 1844, page 4. Although Joseph was done with translations, he never ceased delighting in exhibiting his linguistic talent. Occasionally in his letters and printed appeals for national support, he made proud displays which so embarrassed later historians of his church that they were quietly deleted from the official histories. The most notorious example was his appeal to the freemen of the state of Vermont, the brave Green Mountain Boys and honest men, in which, with a blithe disregard for accuracy, quoted from 17 foreign languages. Were I a Chaldean, I would exclaim, Keed now tamer run le hom elo hio de ya hema yawa ve our call lao gnau badu yabadu ma'ardnau komin tehot she miao Allah. Thus shall ye say unto them, The gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, they shall perish from the earth and from these heavens. An Egyptian, Su-i-ini. What other persons are those? A Grecian, Diabolos Basileui. The devil reigns. A Frenchman, Messieurs Sans Dieu, gentlemen without God. A Turk, Einschems, the fountain of light. A German, Sie sind unverständig, what consummate ignorance. A Syrian, Zaubach, sacrifice. A Spaniard, Il sabio muda conscio it nescio no. A wise man reflects, a fool does not. A Samaritan, sono, O stranger. An Italian, O tempa, O diffidenza. O the times, O the diffidence. A Hebrew, Atau il rawe. Thou, God, seest me. A Dane, What tidende? What tidings? A Saxon, What reet? What right? A Swede, Quod skillia? What skill? Ne yin shuba pon na Jesu Christus. Blessed be the name of Jesus Christ. A Western Indian, Shimo kashimoke, they off nega. The white man, O the white man, he very uncertain. A Roman, Procul, O procul este profani. Be off, ye profane. But as I am, I will only add, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. The Voice of Truth, 1844, pages 16 to 17. See also his letter to James Arlington Bennett, Nauvoo neighbor, the 6th of December, 1843, and his Views on the Powers and Policy of the United States Government, Times and Seasons, Volume 6, May 15, 1844, page 531. The linguistic essays were deleted when these were reprinted in the History of the Church. See Volume 6, pages 75, 197, 209. When Josiah Quincy and Charles Francis Adams visited the prophet, he conducted them personally on a tour about Nauvoo. Quincy wrote in his journal a detailed account of their conversation. As they passed the entrance to the temple, he said, Joseph stopped before a workman who was chiseling an immense face into the rock of a capstone. General Smith, queried the man, looking up from his task, is this like the face you saw in the vision? Very near it, answered the prophet, except, and this, Quincy said, was added with an air of careful connoisseurship that was quite overpowering, except that the nose is just a thought too broad. As they entered the Nauvoo Museum, Joseph introduced Lucy Smith. This is my mother, gentlemen. The curiosities we shall see belong to her. They were purchased with her own money at a cost of $6,000. Opening pine presses along the wall, he disclosed 4 black shrunken bodies. These are mummies, he said. I want you to look at that little runt of a fellow over there. He was a great man in his day. Why, that was Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt. He pointed to various hieroglyphs on the papyri, which were preserved under glass. That is the handwriting of Abraham, the father of the faithful. This is the autograph of Moses, and these lines were written by his brother Aaron. Here we have the earliest accounts of the creation from which Moses composed the first book of Genesis. When Quincy questioned him about a drawing of a serpent walking about on a pair of legs, he expanded heartily, Why, that's as plain as a pikestaff. Before the fall, snakes always went about on legs, just like chickens. They were deprived of them in punishment for their agency in the ruin of man. Although Quincy looked upon this exhibitionism as unexampled absurdity, he was not thereby blinded to the prophet's positive talents. His first impression had been favorable. A fine-looking man is what the passer-by would instinctively have murmured upon meeting the remarkable individual, he wrote. And after conversing several hours, listening to one of his sermons, and making a tour of the orderly city, magnificently laid out, and teeming with activity and enterprise, he was ready to acknowledge that this man, more than almost any other he had ever met, was best endowed with that kingly faculty which directs, as by intrinsic right, the feeble or confused souls who are looking for guidance. Quincy's account is the most sagacious of all the commentaries written by travelers to Nauvoo. If the reader does not know just what to make of Joseph Smith, he concluded, I cannot help him out of the difficulty. I myself stand helpless before the puzzle. Figures of the past. From the Leaves of Old Journals, Boston, 1883, pages 377-400. What had overpowered Josiah Quincy, as indeed it did most of the prophet's visitors, was Joseph's magnificent self-assurance. Increased success had served to intensify his boldness and exuberance. The zest for living that he radiated never failed to inspire his own people with a sense of the richness of life. They followed him slavishly and devotedly, if only to warm themselves in the glow of his presence. They built for him, preached for him, and made unbelievable sacrifices to carry out his orders, not only because they were convinced he was God's prophet, but also because they loved him as a man. They were as elated when he won a wrestling match as they were awed when he dictated a new revelation. They retold tales of his generosity and tenderness, marveling that he fed so many of the poor in Nauvoo at his table without stint, and that he entertained friend and enemy alike. He was a genial host, warm-hearted and friendly to all comers, and fiercely loyal to his friends. Joseph was no hair-shirt prophet. He believed in the good life, with moderate self-indulgence in food and drink, occasional sport, and good entertainment, and that he succeeded in enjoying himself to the hilt detracted not at all from the semi-deification with which his own people enshrouded him. Any protests of impropriety dissolved before his personal charm. Man is that he might have joy, had been one of his first significant pronouncements in the Book of Mormon, and from that belief he had never deviated. He was gregarious, expansive, and genuinely fond of people. And it is no accident that his theology in the end discarded all traces of Calvinism and became an ingenuous blend of supernaturalism and materialism, which promised in heaven a continuation of all earthly pleasures, work, wealth, sex, and power. Since Joseph was himself the personification of the church, its hero and ideal, whatever he did became a pattern for imitation. Because he took Christian theology and ethics and mixed them with business, politics, and empire building, his people came to do the same. The result was that Mormonism became not only a belief, it had never pretended to be a mystical sanctification or even a new ethical code. As a religion, it was as raw-boned and pragmatic as Joseph himself, and as dynamic. Although the prophet was the prime mover in all Mormon thinking and activity, he was himself tremendously affected by the powerful social unit he had created. As thousands of converts poured in from the East and Canada and the British Isles, the increasing pressure of administrative duties, of settling and housing these people and getting work for them, diverted his energy more and more into secular affairs. But there was an equally insistent pressure upon his inner character. These thousands looked to him to usher in the millennium. They clamored for spiritual enlightenment and demanded to know the laws of the kingdom of God. Joseph gave them the best that was in him without affidavits, witnesses, or apology. And to one who reads through his sermons and journal for this period, it must seem that the role of prophet had finally swallowed up the man. But he had moods of uncertainty and doubt, and could occasionally step out of himself and look with humor at what he had become. When Josiah Quincy said to him, "It seems to me, General, that you have too much power to be safely trusted to one man," he replied. "In your hands, or that of any other man, so much power would, no doubt, be dangerous. I am the only man in the world whom it would be safe to trust it with. Remember, I am a prophet." But these last 5 words, Quincy said, were spoken in a rich, comical aside, as if in hearty recognition of the ridiculous sound they might have in the ears of a Gentile. Now and then he startled his own people with an expression of detachment and irony. Once, when introducing the Whig politician Cyrus Walker to his people, he turned to him and said with a little smile, "These are the greatest dupes as a body of people that ever lived, or I am not so big a rogue as I am reported to be." History of the Church, Volume 5, page 472. On another occasion, he confessed with simple candor, "I do not think there have been many good men on earth since the days of Adam, but there was one good man, and his name was Jesus. I love that man better, who swears a stream as long as my arm, yet deals justice to his neighbors, and mercifully deals his substance to the poor, than the long, smooth-faced hypocrite. I do not want you to think I am very righteous, for I am not. God judges men according to the use they make of the light which he gives them." Ibidem, page 401. But such moods were momentary. He went on in this same sermon with a vivid self-characterization that more genuinely represented what Joseph had come to believe himself to be. I am like a huge, rough stone rolling down from a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else, striking with accelerated force against religious bigotry, priestcraft, lawyercraft, doctorcraft, lying editors, suborned judges and jurors, and the authority of perjured executives, backed by mobs, blasphemers, licentious and corrupt men and women. All hell knocking off a corner here and a corner there. Thus will I become a smooth and polished shaft in the quiver of the Almighty, who will give me dominion over all and every one of them, when their refuge of lies shall fail, and their hiding place shall be destroyed.